From the foggy corridors of Alcatraz to the tropical Devil's Island, from the days when ideas grew stronger while breaking rocks on Robben Island to the monastic silence of Eastern State. In Sing Sing, the electric hum of death. In Yodok, the whispers of a camp that does not exist. In S-21, the frozen stares of countless photographs. In Sednaya, walls that refuse to reveal their names. At ADX Florence, a window frames only a sliver of sky. Carandiru still echoes with 1992, and Bastille whispers its lesson of revolt. Tonight, we wander through the most brutal prisons in history, where hope fought to survive, justice was lost, and escapes became legend. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the rock that never broke. You're drifting now toward the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, where fog wraps around an island that once held America's most dangerous minds. Hey friends, if you're enjoying this journey through history's darkest corners, don't forget to like and subscribe for more restful explorations. Built in 1934 on a former military fortress, Alcatraz became the prison where hope went to die. The federal government chose this isolated rock specifically because escape seemed impossible, surrounded by freezing currents and razor-sharp rocks. Inmates like Al Capone lived in 5-by-9-foot cells, enduring complete silence during meals and work. Every day began at 6:30 a.m. with the metallic clang of cell doors, followed by 14 hours of strict routine. The island's most feared punishment was the hole, solitary confinement in absolute darkness. Though only 3 inmates ever officially escaped, rumors persist that the 1962 breakout succeeded. The prison's psychological warfare broke more spirits than its concrete walls ever could. What ghosts still walk those empty corridors, whispering secrets only the fog remembers? You're now floating through the humid air of French Guiana, where palm trees sway above a nightmare disguised as paradise. From 1852 to 1953, France shipped its unwanted souls to this South American colony, creating one of history's cruelest penal systems. Political prisoners, murderers, and petty thieves alike found themselves trapped on islands where yellow fever and dysentery killed more efficiently than any executioner. Inmates worked 15-hour days clearing jungle, building roads, and hauling massive stones under a merciless tropical sun. Those who survived the labor camps faced the bogging's most sinister rule. Even after serving their sentence, prisoners had to remain in the colony for an equal period as liberated convicts. Captain Alfred Dreyfus spent 5 years here in solitary confinement, becoming France's most famous political prisoner. The thick jungle sounds, chirping insects, distant thunder, waves against volcanic rock, became the soundtrack to slow madness. How many dreams dissolved in that green prison beneath the endless burning sky? You're sailing now across the choppy waters off Cape Town, approaching an island where political hope was meant to die but somehow grew stronger. For over 3 centuries, this small island served as a place of banishment. First for indigenous leaders resisting Dutch colonization, then as South Africa's maximum security political prison from 1961 to 1991. Nelson Mandela spent 18 of his 27 prison years here, breaking limestone in the harsh quarry that damaged his eyesight forever. Prisoners woke at 5:30 a.m. to thin porridge and began backbreaking labor by sunrise. Political discussions were forbidden, yet inmates secretly taught each other, turning their cells into Robben Island University. Guards deliberately separated prisoners by race, giving different food rations to create division. The constant crash of Atlantic waves against the island's shores mixed with the sound of hammers striking stone, a rhythm that somehow became revolutionary music. What seemed like isolation became a forge for South Africa's future leaders. Can concrete walls ever truly contain an idea whose time has come? You're walking now through the abandoned corridors of Philadelphia, where silence was once considered the path to salvation. When Eastern State opened in 1829, It pioneered the revolutionary concept of solitary confinement as rehabilitation. Designed like a massive stone wheel with spokes radiating from a central hub, it housed over 1,700 inmates at its peak. Each prisoner lived completely alone in an 8 by 12-foot cell with a small exercise yard, seeing only guards and ministers for months or years at a time. The Quaker-inspired system required absolute silence. Inmates wore hoods when moving through hallways and ate meals without speaking. Many prisoners went insane from the isolation, yet the Pennsylvania system influenced prison design worldwide. Al Capone spent 8 months here decorating his cell with expensive furniture and a radio. The soft echo of footsteps on stone floors and the distant hymns from the prison chapel created an atmosphere more like a monastery than a penitentiary. What happens to the human spirit when silence becomes both punishment and prayer? You're standing now beside the Hudson River in New York, where the sounds of rushing water once masked the hum of deadly machinery. Built by inmates themselves in 1826, Sing Sing became synonymous with capital punishment after installing America's first electric chair in 1891. Over 600 executions took place here, more than any other prison in U.S. history. Prisoners worked in complete silence, manufacturing everything from carpets to license plates in the prison's massive industrial workshops. The infamous Death House held condemned inmates in cells just steps from the electric chair, creating unbearable psychological pressure. Daily life revolved around the 6 a.m. wake-up bell, followed by 16 hours of silent labor and sparse meals eaten without conversation. The prison's own newspaper, Star of Hope, was written entirely by inmates yet heavily censored. Train whistles from nearby tracks and the steady flow of the Hudson River provided the only sounds breaking the oppressive quiet. How does a place built by prisoners' hands become the instrument of their ultimate punishment? You're drifting across the Mediterranean toward a fortress where literature blurred the lines between reality and romance. This 16th-century fortress off Marseille's coast imprisoned political and religious dissidents for over 400 years. But Alexandre Dumas made it immortal in The Count of Monte Cristo. Real prisoners included Protestant ministers, political rebels, and mysterious figures like the Man in the Iron Mask. Inmates lived in tiny stone cells carved directly into the fortress walls, enduring Mediterranean heat in summer and bone-chilling cold in winter. The fortress's most feared punishment was the bottle, a narrow cell where prisoners couldn't fully stand or lie down. Daily meals consisted of black bread and water served through a slot in heavy wooden doors. The sound of waves crashing against the fortress walls mixed with seagulls' cries and the creaking of chains. Prisoners spent decades staring at the same patch of sea, counting ships that represented freedom they'd never taste. Where does the real prison end and the literary one begin in our collective memory? You're walking now across ancient stone bridges where ravens gather, their black wings shadowing a fortress that witnessed 1,000 years of royal betrayal. Since 1100, the tower has served as palace, armory, treasury, and prison for England's most dangerous political prisoners. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey all met their ends here, victims of Henry VIII's volatile reign. Prisoners of royal blood lived in relative comfort in the bloody tower, while common criminals suffered in the dungeon's rats and dampness. The most feared torture was the rack, which slowly stretched victims until their joints separated. Executions took place at Tower Green, where privileged prisoners died by sword rather than the public axe at nearby Tower Hill. The daily routine included morning prayers, sparse meals, and long hours of solitary contemplation. The soft footsteps of yeoman warders, the distant Thames flowing past ancient walls, and the raven's eternal watch created an atmosphere where history felt alive in every shadow. What secrets do those ancient stones still whisper to the ravens who never leave? You're descending now into the sprawling favelas of Sao Paulo, where concrete walls once contained humanity's most desperate overflow. Built for 4,000 inmates, Carandiru housed over 8,000 at its peak, becoming Latin America's largest and most violent prison before its demolition in 2002. The 1992 massacre, when police killed 111 inmates during a riot, shocked the world and exposed the brutal reality of Brazil's prison system. Inmates created their own economy, governance, and justice system to survive the overcrowding. Cells designed for single occupancy held up to 8 men, forcing prisoners to sleep in shifts. The prison's most notorious feature was the microwave, metal punishment cells that became unbearably hot under the tropical sun. Daily survival meant navigating complex hierarchies, from drug lords to religious leaders who maintained order through fear and respect. The constant noise of thousands of voices, metal doors slamming, and generators humming created a cacophony that never stopped. How does humanity adapt when the system designed to contain it completely breaks down? You're traveling now across the endless Siberian tundra, where winter lasts 8 months and hope froze to death decades ago. From 1930 to 1956, the Soviet Union's forced labor camps stretched across 2,000 locations, holding an estimated 15–20 million prisoners at various times. Political dissidents, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of counter-revolutionary activities found themselves cutting timber, mining gold, and building canals in temperatures reaching 40 degrees. Prisoners received 300–400 grams of bread daily, barely enough to survive the brutal physical labor. The camps operated on a simple principle. Those who met their work quotas received slightly better rations, while those who didn't slowly starved. Barracks held 200–300 prisoners on wooden bunks without mattresses, heated by single stoves that barely warmed the nearest beds. The sound of wind howling across frozen wastelands mixed with the rhythmic chopping of axes and the creak of overloaded sleds. What becomes of a nation's soul when suffering is industrialized on such a massive scale? You're approaching now the ancient walls of a fortress where French royalty learned that even kings could become prisoners of their own creation. Built in the 14th century as a royal residence, Vincennes became France's state prison for high-ranking political prisoners before the Revolution. The massive keep, standing 170 feet tall, housed nobles who had fallen from grace and intellectuals whose ideas threatened the monarchy. The most famous inmate, the Marquis de Sade, spent 6 years here writing his controversial works on paper smuggled by sympathetic guards. Daily life revolved around morning mass, simple meals of bread and thin soup, and long hours of enforced solitude. The fortress's most cruel punishment was the oubliette, a bottle-shaped dungeon where prisoners were lowered by rope and forgotten. The soft chanting of monks from the nearby chapel mixed with the sound of wind through arrow slits and the distant clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones. How many forgotten souls still echo in those towers, their stories lost to royal discretion? You're walking now through the narrow streets of Montparnasse, where behind elegant Parisian facades stands a fortress that pioneered psychological punishment through isolation. Built in 1867 following the Pennsylvania model, La Santé introduced complete cellular isolation to France, housing each prisoner in individual 9-square-meter cells. The prison's 5-story radial design allowed guards to observe 1,400 inmates from a central watchtower, creating constant surveillance that drove many to madness. Prisoners worked in absolute silence, manufacturing shoes and clothing for 16 hours daily, forbidden from speaking even during the brief exercise periods in tiny individual courtyards. The facility's most dreaded feature was the mitard, punishment cells where inmates spent weeks in near-total darkness on bread and water. Famous residents included anarchists, collaborators during World War II, and common criminals who experienced the same crushing routine. The soft echo of footsteps on metal walkways and the distant murmur of Parisian traffic beyond the walls created a strange contrast between urban life and buried existence. How does a city of lights contain such deliberate darkness within its heart? You're traveling now across the ancient Syrian desert, where Roman ruins cast shadows over a modern monument to systematic cruelty. Located near the historic city of Palmyra, Tadmor operated from 1971 to 2001 as Syria's most feared political prison, designed to break the spirits of anyone opposing the Assad regime. Built to hold 4,000 inmates, it often contained twice that number in overcrowded cells where prisoners slept in shifts on concrete floors. The desert prison's daily routine began at 4 a.m. with brutal roll calls, followed by forced labor under the scorching sun with minimal water rations. Political prisoners faced the tire, forced to bend through a tire while guards beat their feet or hung by their wrists for days. The facility's most terrifying feature was the complete prohibition on speaking. Inmates communicated through whispers and hand signals, creating an eerie silence punctuated only by guard commands and the desert wind. The prison's isolation in the vast Syrian desert made escape attempts nearly impossible, as the harsh landscape became another jailer. What happens when an entire building becomes a weapon against hope itself? You're drifting now down the Volga River toward a small island, where Russia's most dangerous criminals learned that water makes the most effective bars. This maximum security facility, operational since 2001, houses Russia's most violent inmates on a 7-hectare island surrounded by the Volga's cold waters. Designed for absolute isolation, the prison holds only 228 inmates in single cells, each monitored by sophisticated surveillance systems that record every movement and conversation. Prisoners wake at 6 a.m. to the sound of metal doors unlocking simultaneously, beginning days structured around solitary meals, individual exercise in caged courtyards, and complete prohibition of contact with other inmates. The island's unique punishment system includes sensory deprivation cells and rooms where temperatures can be adjusted to create extreme discomfort without causing permanent harm. Guards use boats to transport supplies and personnel, making the prison essentially unreachable except by official means. The constant sound of water lapping against the island's shores and the cry of river birds create an almost peaceful atmosphere that contrasts sharply with the controlled desperation within the walls. Can isolation become so complete that even the guards become prisoners of their own system? You're standing now in the Caucasus Mountains, where a former Soviet facility became the center of a scandal that toppled a government. Built as a standard Soviet correctional facility, Gulag Prison near Tbilisi gained international notoriety in 2012 when leaked videos revealed systematic torture and sexual abuse of inmates by guards. Designed for 1,500 prisoners, the facility held over 2,400 men in conditions that human rights groups called medieval. Inmates slept on concrete floors in cells designed for half their number, using plastic bottles as toilets and eating watery soup with moldy bread twice daily. The prison's unofficial hierarchy allowed certain inmates to terrorize others with guards' implicit approval, creating a system where violence became both punishment and entertainment. Daily routines involved arbitrary beatings, forced nudity during searches, and psychological humiliation designed to destroy personal dignity. The facility's most notorious feature was the complete absence of medical care, leaving sick prisoners to suffer or die without intervention. The mountain winds carrying sounds from the outside world served as constant reminders of the freedom just beyond the razor wire. How does a nation confront the monsters it created in its own name? You're descending now into the Romanian countryside, where a communist experiment in re-education became history's most systematic attempt to destroy the human soul. From 1949 to 1952, this former monastery became the site of an unprecedented psychological torture program designed to transform political prisoners into enthusiastic supporters of communism. The facility held intellectuals, students, and clergy who underwent re-education through a process that forced prisoners to torture and denounce each other, creating cycles of guilt and complicity that shattered minds and moral foundations. Inmates were required to confess not only their own crimes, but to invent and denounce the sins of their cellmates, creating an atmosphere of total distrust. The daily routine included forced participation in humiliating exercises, destruction of religious or personal symbols, and sessions where prisoners had to beat their closest friends while guards watched. The program's most insidious element was its requirement that converted prisoners become torturers themselves, spreading the psychological destruction through the entire prison population. The soft prayers once echoed in these monastery walls were replaced by screams, confessions, and the terrible silence of broken spirits. What remains of humanity when the very concept of truth becomes a weapon against itself? You're approaching now the industrial outskirts of Athens, where ancient Greek ideals of justice collide with modern realities of poverty and neglect. Built in 1960 to house 800 inmates, Korydallos regularly holds over 2,000 prisoners in conditions that European human rights monitors have repeatedly condemned. The facility's overcrowding forces 3 to 4 inmates to share cells designed for one person, creating tensions that regularly explode into violence between rival criminal organizations. Prisoners wake to the sound of metal doors slamming and spend most days locked in their overcrowded cells with minimal exercise time in concrete yards surrounded by high walls. The prison's most dangerous feature is its inability to separate different criminal factions, leading to ongoing conflicts between anarchist groups, traditional criminals, and Albanian gangs. Daily survival requires navigating complex hierarchies and unwritten rules that determine access to everything from food to protection. The facility's medical clinic is overwhelmed and understaffed, leaving many prisoners to suffer from untreated illnesses while waiting months for basic care. The Mediterranean sun beats down on concrete courtyards where hope seems as scarce as space. How does the birthplace of democracy reconcile its ideals with such systematic dehumanization? You're traveling now to the humid coast of West Africa, where a colonial legacy became an African dictator's tool of absolute control. Built by Spanish colonizers and expanded after independence in 1968, Black Beach Prison on Bioko Island serves as Equatorial Guinea's primary detention facility for political prisoners who dare oppose President Obiang's regime. The prison holds an estimated 1,000 inmates in facilities designed for 300. With many political prisoners spending years in cells without windows or adequate ventilation. Prisoners survive on one meal of rice or cassava daily, often supplemented by food smuggled by families who risk imprisonment themselves by visiting. The facility's most feared section houses death row inmates in underground cells, where tropical humidity and poor ventilation create nearly unbearable conditions. Daily routine consists of long periods locked in overcrowded cells, with occasional forced labor, clearing land or maintaining prison grounds under armed guard supervision. The prison's isolation on an island makes escape virtually impossible, while the complete lack of legal representation means most inmates never see the inside of a courtroom. Ocean breezes carry salt air through barred windows, offering the only relief from the stifling heat and hopelessness within. What becomes of justice when an entire nation becomes a prison for its own people? You're walking now through Moscow's historic center, where a fortress built for czarist criminals became Soviet Russia's most famous detention center. Constructed in 1771 under Catherine the Great, Butyrka has continuously operated as Moscow's main remand prison, holding everyone from revolutionaries to modern-day oligarchs awaiting trial. The facility's thick stone walls and medieval architecture create an atmosphere where centuries of suffering seem to echo through narrow corridors and cramped cells. During the Soviet era, political prisoners shared space with common criminals, creating volatile conditions where survival often depended on understanding complex hierarchies and unwritten codes. Inmates spend most days in overcrowded cells holding up to 20 men, sleeping in shifts on wooden bunks while sharing a single toilet and sink. The prison's most notorious feature is its Stolypin cars, train compartments used to transport prisoners to Siberian labor camps named after the prime minister who expanded their use. Daily meals consist of thin soup, black bread, and tea served in metal bowls that prisoners must clean and return immediately. The sound of church bells from nearby monasteries filters through barred windows, offering glimpses of the spiritual life that many prisoners desperately seek. How does a building absorb centuries of human suffering and somehow continue functioning? You're crossing now the dusty plains outside Kabul, where a massive complex rises from the desert like a monument to Afghanistan's endless cycles of conflict. Built in the 1970s with American funding as a modern correctional facility, Puli Charkhi became Afghanistan's largest prison, holding over 5,000 inmates in conditions that deteriorated through decades of war and political upheaval. The facility's 7 blocks were designed to separate different categories of prisoners, but chronic overcrowding and limited resources mean that political prisoners, common criminals, and Taliban fighters often share the same overcrowded cells. Prisoners wake before dawn to the call to prayer echoing across concrete courtyards, beginning days structured around 5 daily prayers and survival in an environment where clean water and adequate food remain constant struggles. The prison's most challenging aspect is its mix of ethnicities, political affiliations, and tribal loyalties, creating tensions that guards struggle to manage with limited training and resources. Daily routine includes forced labor, maintaining prison grounds, weaving carpets, or working in workshops that produce goods sold to support prison operations. The constant sound of helicopters overhead and distant explosions serve as reminders of the ongoing conflict that feeds the prison's population. What hope exists when a nation's trauma becomes concentrated within a single set of walls? You're climbing now through Lima's dusty hills toward a complex where 9,000 inmates govern themselves in South America's most overcrowded prison. Dear listeners, if you're finding these stories both fascinating and calming, don't forget to subscribe for more gentle journeys through history's most intriguing corners. Built in 1968 for 2,500 inmates, Lurigancho operates more like an autonomous city than a traditional prison, with inmates running businesses, marriages, and even schools within its walls. The facility's 26 pavilions function as separate neighborhoods, each controlled by different criminal organizations that maintain order through their own justice systems and economic structures. Prisoners with money can rent comfortable cells with televisions and private bathrooms, while the poor sleep on floors in overcrowded communal areas with minimal sanitation. The prison's most unique feature is its thriving internal economy. Inmates operate restaurants, shops, and manufacturing businesses that employ hundreds of prisoners in legitimate work. Daily life varies dramatically based on social status and criminal connections, with some prisoners living comfortably while others struggle to survive on minimal rations. The complex houses entire families, as some inmates' wives and children live within the prison walls, creating a strange community where life, crime, and punishment blend into something resembling normal society. The sound of children playing mixes with traditional Andean music and the constant hum of commercial activity. When does a prison stop being a prison and become simply another place where people live? You're standing now in the Colorado Rockies, where the United States built a fortress designed to contain its most dangerous mines in complete isolation. Opened in 1994, the Administrative Maximum Facility houses 400 of America's most notorious criminals in conditions that United Nations observers have called psychological torture. Inmates spend 23 hours daily in 7 by 12-foot concrete cells with slot-fed meals and 1 hour of solitary exercise in concrete recreational cages. The facility's sophisticated design prevents any human contact. Prisoners cannot see guards or other inmates during their brief movements through the corridors. Each cell contains a concrete bed, stainless steel toilet, and a narrow window that shows only a slice of empty sky. The prison's most unsettling feature is its absolute silence, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the distant echo of steel doors. Famous residents include the Unabomber, Boston Marathon bomber, and various terrorists who exist in a limbo of sensory deprivation. The mountain winds outside carry the scent of pine forests that inmates will never smell, while inside, recycled air and fluorescent lighting create an eternal artificial day. What happens to the human mind when solitude becomes a life sentence? You're traveling now across the Kenyan highlands, where a British colonial facility became independent Kenya's most feared detention center. Built in 1954 during the Mau Mau uprising to hold Kikuyu freedom fighters, Kamiti has evolved into Kenya's primary maximum security facility, housing over 2,500 inmates, in conditions that remain largely unchanged since colonial times. The prison's notorious death row holds condemned prisoners in individual cells for years, while their appeals work through Kenya's overwhelmed court system. Inmates wake at 5 a.m. to the sound of metal bells and spend their days in forced labor, breaking stones, farming prison grounds, or manufacturing furniture in poorly ventilated workshops. The facility's most feared punishment is the hole, underground cells where prisoners spend weeks in complete darkness on reduced rations. Daily meals consist of ugali, beans, and vegetables grown on prison farms by the inmates themselves under armed guard supervision. The tropical climate creates unbearable heat in the metal-roofed workshops, while the rainy season turns dirt courtyards into muddy quagmires. Acacia trees surrounding the compound provide the only shade, their thorny branches serving as natural barriers alongside the electrified fences. How does a nation transform the tools of its oppression into instruments of its own justice? You're approaching now the foothills of Tehran's mountains, where a facility built for the Shah's enemies became the Islamic Republic's instrument of ideological control. Constructed in 1971 under the Pahlavi regime, Evan gained international notoriety after 1979 as the Islamic Republic's primary detention center for political prisoners, journalists, and intellectuals. The prison's complex design includes separate wards for different categories of prisoners, from common criminals to high-profile political dissidents who face interrogation and indefinite detention. Inmates experience a daily routine of enforced prayers, ideological lectures, and forced confessions designed to break psychological resistance rather than simply punish criminal behavior. The facility's most infamous section is Ward 209, where political prisoners undergo months of solitary confinement and interrogation sessions aimed at extracting confessions and renunciations of their beliefs. Prison conditions vary dramatically based on political status and compliance. Cooperative prisoners receive books and family visits, while resistors face years of isolation and psychological pressure. The sound of the call to prayer echoes through concrete corridors 5 times daily, while the distant noise of Tehran's traffic serves as a constant reminder of the normal life continuing just beyond the walls. What becomes of truth when a nation's prisons become laboratories for ideological conversion? You're sailing now through the cold waters of the Tasman Sea toward a peninsula where the British Empire created its most innovative and feared penal experiment. Operating from 1833 to 1877, Port Arthur represented the pinnacle of 19th-century prison design, using Tasmania's geography to create an inescapable prison surrounded by shark-infested waters and dense wilderness. The facility pioneered the separate system, holding 1,100 convicts in individual cells while implementing complete silence during all activities, from meals to chapel services. Prisoners worked in timber mills, shipyards, and coal mines under strict supervision, with any infractions punished by solitary confinement in the notorious Model Prison, where inmates wore masks and were known only by numbers. The settlement's most feared element was its psychological approach. Rather than physical punishment, the system aimed to break spirits through sensory deprivation and social isolation. Daily routine began at 5:30 a.m. with bell signals, followed by 14 hours of silent labor and mandatory evening prayers in a chapel where prisoners sat in individual wooden boxes to prevent any communication. The constant sound of southern ocean waves against rocky cliffs mixed with the rhythmic hammering from workshops and the occasional cry of Tasmanian devils in the surrounding wilderness. How does isolation become so complete that freedom itself becomes unimaginable? You're walking now through the cobblestone streets of medieval Paris, approaching a fortress that became the most famous prison in European history before revolutionaries tore it down stone by stone. Built in 1370 as a fortress to defend Paris, the Bastille evolved into the Bourbon monarchy's premier state prison, holding aristocrats, intellectuals, and political prisoners in relative comfort compared to common jails. The fortress's 8 towers contained apartments rather than cells, where wealthy prisoners could bring servants, furniture, and books while enjoying regular meals and family visits. However, the prison's true power lay in the lettre de cachet, royal arrest warrants that could imprison anyone indefinitely without trial or formal charges. The facility's most mysterious element was its anonymous prisoners, including the legendary Man in the Iron Mask, who spent decades hidden behind a velvet mask to conceal his identity. Daily life for prisoners varied dramatically based on social status. Nobles dined on fine meals and received visitors, while commoners languished in basement dungeons with minimal food and no contact with the outside world. The soft footsteps of guards in the courtyards mixed with the distant bells of Notre Dame and the murmur of Parisian merchants beyond the walls. When revolutionaries stormed the fortress on July 14, 1789, they found only 7 prisoners, but unleashed a symbolic power that toppled an empire. What makes a building so powerful that its destruction becomes the birth cry of a new world? You're traveling now across the endless Siberian wilderness, where Stalin created a forced labor camp that combined the brutality of Arctic conditions with the deadly pursuit of gold extraction. Established in 1937 in the remote Kolyma region, Orotuken housed over 15,000 prisoners who worked in gold mines during temperatures that regularly dropped below 60 degrees, creating conditions where survival itself became a daily struggle against nature and human cruelty. The facility's wooden barracks and mining operations spread across permafrost terrain, where prisoners worked 12-hour shifts extracting gold using primitive equipment while guards shot anyone who collapsed from exhaustion or cold. Inmates survived on bread rations and thin soup designed to maintain just enough strength for mining work, while the Arctic climate killed through frostbite, pneumonia, and gradual starvation that claimed thousands of lives annually. The camp's most deadly feature was its quota system. Prisoners who failed to meet daily gold extraction targets received reduced food rations, creating a death spiral where weakness led to starvation and starvation led to death. Daily routine began before dawn with roll call in Arctic darkness, followed by descent into mine shafts where cave-ins and equipment failures regularly buried workers who had no choice but to continue digging for Soviet gold. The sound of howling Arctic winds mixed with the constant noise of mining equipment and prisoner work songs that helped maintain morale in an environment designed to destroy human spirit. When the camp finally closed in 1957, authorities had extracted millions in gold using slave labor that cost more lives than the precious metal was worth. How does a regime calculate the value of gold against the price of human souls? You're walking now through the narrow streets of Old Hanoi, where a French colonial prison became famous for holding American pilots during the Vietnam War. Built by French colonizers in 1896, Hoa Lo originally held Vietnamese revolutionaries fighting for independence, but gained international notoriety as the Hanoi Hilton when it housed American POWs during the Vietnam conflict. The facility's thick stone walls and medieval design reflected French colonial attitudes toward Vietnamese prisoners, who faced overcrowding, malnutrition, and systematic torture designed to extract information about independence movements. Vietnamese prisoners developed sophisticated communication systems using tapping codes and hidden messages, maintaining morale through shared resistance against colonial oppression. During the American War, the prison held pilots like John McCain in small cells where they faced interrogation, propaganda sessions, and psychological pressure to make anti-war statements for North Vietnamese media. The facility's most challenging aspect was its dual function as both punishment and propaganda tool. Prisoners faced not only physical hardship, but constant pressure to participate in activities that would undermine their own country's war effort. The tropical heat made the concrete cells nearly unbearable, while monsoon rains created flooding that mixed with primitive sanitation systems. Street vendors' calls and bicycle bells from Hanoi's busy streets filtered through barred windows, offering tantalizing reminders of normal life continuing just beyond the walls. How does a prison become a symbol of both colonial oppression and wartime propaganda? You're climbing now through Albania's rugged mountains toward a copper mine, where Enver Hoxha's communist regime created one of Europe's most isolated and brutal political prisons. Operating from 1968 to 1991, SPAS combined imprisonment with forced labor in dangerous copper mines, housing political prisoners who worked 12-hour shifts extracting ore in primitive conditions without safety equipment. The facility's remote location in Albania's northern mountains made escape virtually impossible, while the combination of hard labor, altitude, and minimal food rations created a slow death sentence for many inmates. Prisoners faced a daily routine beginning at 4 a.m. with thin coffee and bread, followed by descent into mine shafts where cave-ins, gas leaks, and equipment failures regularly killed workers who had no choice but to continue digging. The prison's most feared aspect was its complete isolation from Albanian society. Families often never learned whether their relatives were alive or dead, while the outside world remained largely ignorant of the facility's existence. Political prisoners included intellectuals, clergy, and anyone suspected of opposing Hoxha's paranoid regime, creating an educated population forced to perform dangerous manual labor for which they had no training. Mountain winds carrying the scent of pine forests mixed with the acrid smell of copper dust and the constant noise of mining equipment echoing through the valleys. The facility's brutal conditions were matched only by the beauty of its setting, where snow-capped peaks and pristine wilderness surrounded one of Europe's most hellish prisons. What happens when a dictator's paranoia transforms an entire mountain into a tomb for ideas? You're standing now in Madrid's outskirts, where Franco's regime built a massive prison that became both architectural marvel and symbol of authoritarian control. Designed in 1944 using Jeremy Bentham's panopticon concept, Carabanchel housed up to 8,000 inmates in a radial structure that allowed guards to observe every prisoner from a central watchtower. The facility's imposing brutalist architecture reflected Franco's authoritarian ideology, with massive concrete walls and narrow windows that made escape virtually impossible while creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Political prisoners faced especially harsh treatment, spending years in solitary confinement for crimes as minor as possessing banned books or speaking Catalan in public spaces. The prison's daily routine emphasized complete submission to authority. Inmates marched in silence, ate prescribed meals at precise times, and participated in mandatory political indoctrination sessions designed to transform Republicans into loyal Franco supporters. The facility's most notorious feature was its gallery of death, cells housing condemned prisoners who awaited execution by garrote, a Spanish method of strangulation that Franco retained long after other European nations abolished capital punishment. The sound of church bells from nearby Madrid neighborhoods mixed with the constant noise of metal doors and guard commands echoing through the facility's circular galleries. Despite its imposing design, Carabanchel became famous for spectacular escape attempts, including a 1981 helicopter rescue that captured international attention and demonstrated that even the most sophisticated prison architecture cannot contain human determination. How does a building designed for perfect surveillance become a stage for perfect rebellion? You're traveling now through the remote mountains of North Korea, where an entire generation has lived and died in a prison camp that officially does not exist. Established in 1970, Yodok Political Prison Camp 15 holds an estimated 50,000 prisoners in a valley surrounded by mountains that serve as natural barriers against escape. The facility operates as a complete society where 3 generations of families serve sentences for political crimes committed by their ancestors, creating a population that has known no life outside the camp's electric fences. Prisoners work in coal mines, logging operations, and agricultural projects from dawn to dusk, surviving on corn soup and wild plants while guards receive orders to shoot anyone approaching the perimeter. The camp's most dystopian feature is its schools, where children born in the facility learn basic reading and political indoctrination while remaining completely ignorant of the outside world or their families' supposed crimes. Daily life revolves around survival rather than punishment. Inmates focus on finding food, avoiding hypothermia during brutal mountain winters, and navigating the complex social hierarchies that determine access to slightly better work assignments. The camp's existence remains officially denied by North Korean authorities, making it one of the few prisons where the outside world's ignorance becomes part of the punishment. Mountain streams and forest sounds create an almost peaceful atmosphere that contrasts sharply with the systematic destruction of human dignity occurring within the camp's boundaries. What happens when an entire society becomes a prison that refuses to acknowledge its own existence? You're walking now through the quiet streets of Phnom Penh, where a former high school became the epicenter of the Khmer Rouge's systematic attempt to reshape human nature through terror. From 1975 to 1979, Security Prison 21 processed over 14,000 prisoners through a bureaucratic machine of torture and execution designed to extract confessions from perceived enemies of Pol Pot's agrarian revolution. The facility's classrooms were converted into torture chambers and holding cells, where prisoners faced daily interrogations aimed at forcing them to confess to elaborate conspiracies against the regime. Inmates survived on watery rice porridge served once daily, while enduring psychological pressure designed to make them betray family members, friends, and colleagues in detailed written confessions. The prison's most chilling feature was its meticulous documentation. Every prisoner was photographed, every confession recorded, every execution logged in ledgers that staff maintained with bureaucratic precision. Daily routine involved constant interrogation, forced confession writing, and the gradual destruction of personal identity through systematic humiliation and isolation. The sound of tropical birds singing in the courtyard's trees mixed with the scratch of pencils on paper as prisoners wrote their own death sentences. Only 7 prisoners survived to witness the Vietnamese Liberation Forces arrive in 1979. How does a revolution consume itself by devouring everyone it claims to save? You're sailing now across the Adriatic Sea toward a barren island where Tito's Yugoslavia created a prison designed to break communist dissidents through communist methods. Established in 1949 for political prisoners who opposed Stalin's influence over Yugoslavia, Goli Otok became a re-education camp where prisoners built their own prison while undergoing ideological transformation through forced labor and peer pressure. The island's harsh landscape provided no natural shelter, forcing incoming prisoners to construct barracks, workshops, and guard facilities using only hand tools and stones quarried from the rocky terrain. Inmates faced a daily routine designed around mutual surveillance and criticism. Prisoners were required to report on each other's political attitudes and participate in self-criticism sessions where they confessed ideological errors to their cellmates. The facility's most psychologically destructive element was its use of prisoners as guards and informants. creating an atmosphere where survival often depended on betraying fellow inmates to demonstrate loyalty to the regime. Work involved 12 hours of stone breaking, road construction, and building maintenance under the scorching Adriatic sun with minimal water and inadequate food rations. The constant sound of waves against rocks mixed with the rhythmic hammering of stone breaking and the harsh voices of prisoners conducting criticism sessions. Unlike other communist prisons, Goli Otok aimed to convert rather than simply punish, making psychological transformation part of the punishment itself. What happens when a political system turns imprisonment into a twisted form of salvation? You're traveling now through the hills of southern Lebanon, where an Israeli allied militia operated a detention facility that became synonymous with the region's complex proxy conflicts. Operating from 1985 to 2000 under the South Lebanon Army, Qiyam held Palestinian and Lebanese prisoners in conditions that international observers described as systematic torture designed to extract intelligence about resistance activities. The facility's concrete cells, built partially underground, housed prisoners in complete darkness for months, while guards used a combination of physical and psychological pressure to break resistance to Israeli occupation. Inmates experienced a daily routine of arbitrary interrogations, forced standing for hours, and exposure to extreme temperatures designed to disorient and weaken psychological defenses. The prison's most notorious feature was its use of Lebanese militiamen as guards and interrogators, creating a dynamic where neighbors tortured neighbors in service of foreign occupation forces. Prisoners survived on minimal rations of bread and water while enduring electric shock, prolonged binding, and sensory deprivation that many survivors described as more effective than physical torture. The sound of Israeli jets overhead and distant artillery fire served as constant reminders of the larger conflict that fed the prison's population. When Israeli forces withdrew in 2000, local residents immediately liberated the facility and converted it into a museum documenting the occupation's brutality. How does a small prison become a symbol of an entire nation's suffering under foreign occupation? You're standing now in Santiago's peaceful suburbs, where a torture center disguised as a recreation facility became the heart of Pinochet's campaign against Chilean democracy. From 1974 to 1978, this former estate served as the National Intelligence Directorate's primary detention and torture center, processing over 4,500 political prisoners through a systematic program designed to destroy Chile's leftist opposition. The facility's pleasant exterior, complete with gardens and recreational areas, concealed interrogation rooms, torture chambers, and holding cells where prisoners faced months of psychological and physical pressure. Inmates endured a daily routine of arbitrary interrogations, forced labor maintaining the facility's grounds, and participation in mock executions designed to break psychological resistance to military rule. The center's most insidious feature was its use of psychological torture alongside physical methods. Prisoners faced threats against family members, exposure to the screams of other victims, and elaborate mind games designed to destroy their sense of reality. Guards deliberately maintained the facility's recreational atmosphere, forcing prisoners to participate in sports and social activities between torture sessions, creating a surreal environment where normalcy and brutality coexisted. The sound of children playing in nearby neighborhoods mixed with screams from interrogation rooms, while the scent of flowers from the estate's gardens mingled with the fear and desperation of political prisoners. When democracy returned to Chile, survivors transformed the site into a memorial park, where visitors can walk through peaceful gardens while contemplating the horrors that occurred beneath their feet. How does a nation heal when its most beautiful places hide its darkest memories? You're approaching now the hills outside Damascus, where a military prison became the center of the Assad regime's systematic campaign against Syrian opposition. Built in 1987 as a military facility, Sednaya gained international notoriety during Syria's civil war as a site where an estimated 17,000 prisoners have been executed in secret since 2011. The prison's white buildings, visible from Damascus, house an estimated 10,000, 20,000 political prisoners in underground cells designed for a fraction of that number. Inmates survive on minimal rations of bread and thin soup, while enduring systematic torture designed to extract confessions and break any resistance to the Assad government. The facility's most terrifying feature is its complete secrecy. Families have no information about imprisoned relatives, while the outside world remains largely ignorant of the systematic killing occurring within its walls. Daily routine involves mass hangings conducted in basement areas, arbitrary beatings, and forced labor maintaining the prison while new prisoners arrive constantly from Syria's ongoing conflict. The sound of Damascus traffic and normal life continues just miles away, while inside the prison, the silence of systematic murder replaces any hope of justice or survival. International human rights organizations have documented the facility's operations through survivor testimony and satellite imagery, but the prison continues operating with complete impunity. What happens when a government's war against its own people becomes industrialized murder? You're traveling now deep into the Ural Mountains, where the Soviet Union's last political prison has become Russia's most important memorial to the victims of communist repression. Operating from 1946 to 1987, Perm 36 held Soviet political prisoners in conditions designed to break their resistance through isolation, forced labor, and systematic deprivation in one of Russia's harshest climates. The facility's wooden barracks and watchtowers, preserved in the Siberian wilderness, housed dissidents who faced daily routines of logging, metalwork, and construction projects in temperatures that regularly dropped below 40 degrees. Prisoners survived on bread rations and thin soup while working 12-hour shifts in forests and workshops, where frostbite and exhaustion created constant threats to survival. The camp's most psychologically devastating feature was its complete isolation from Soviet society. Prisoners received no news from the outside world and faced years of uncertainty about their families' fates. Daily life revolved around survival rather than rehabilitation, with inmates focusing on staying warm, finding extra food, and maintaining sanity during long months of winter darkness. The sound of wind through pine forests mixed with the rhythmic sawing of timber and the creak of overloaded sledges carrying logs to workshops. When the camp closed in 1987, local activists preserved it as a museum where visitors can experience the daily reality of Soviet political repression while learning about the human cost of totalitarian rule. How does a nation confront its past when the evidence stands frozen in time? You're flying now over the dusty plains of Afghanistan toward a former Soviet airbase that became America's most controversial detention facility during the War on Terror. Established in 2002 on a massive military base north of Kabul, Bagram Detention Facility held suspected Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in conditions that human rights groups compared to Guantanamo Bay, but with less international oversight. The facility's metal-walled cells housed over 600 detainees at its peak, creating overcrowding that forced prisoners to sleep in shifts while enduring interrogations designed to extract intelligence about insurgent activities. Inmates faced a daily routine of prayer calls, communal meals, and exercise periods, punctuated by arbitrary interrogations and transfers that could last for years without formal charges or legal representation. The prison's most controversial feature was its use of indefinite detention. Prisoners could be held for years based on intelligence reports rather than criminal evidence, creating a legal limbo that international observers criticized as violation of human rights. Daily life involved navigating cultural conflicts between American guards and Afghan prisoners, language barriers that complicated basic communication, and uncertainty about when or whether release might occur. The sound of military aircraft and helicopters overhead mixed with the call to prayer echoing through metal corridors, while the distant mountains of the Hindu Kush provided a constant reminder of Afghanistan's strategic importance. When American forces withdrew in 2021, they transferred control of the facility to Afghan authorities, leaving behind a complex legacy of detention practices that shaped America's longest war. How does a temporary military facility become a permanent symbol of an entire war's moral ambiguity? You're approaching now the outskirts of Stuttgart, where West Germany built a fortress-like facility to hold members of the Red Army faction during the country's struggle with domestic terrorism. Constructed in 1963 but gaining notoriety during the 1970s, German Autumn, Stammheim became the stage for dramatic trials and mysterious deaths that defined West Germany's confrontation with radical terrorism. The facility's high-security wing housed Red Army faction leaders like Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof in isolation cells designed to prevent any communication with outside supporters or fellow terrorists. Inmates faced a daily routine of solitary confinement, limited exercise, and constant surveillance designed to prevent escape attempts and restrict access to information that could support ongoing terrorist activities. The prison's most famous feature was its specially constructed courtroom, where televised trials became media spectacles that divided German public opinion about state security versus civil liberties. Prisoners endured psychological pressure from complete isolation, while lawyers and supporters outside organized protests and solidarity campaigns that turned the trials into political theater. The sound of protesters outside the prison walls mixed with the constant noise of helicopters and police sirens, while inside, the silence of maximum security created an atmosphere where every conversation was monitored and recorded. When several RAF leaders died mysteriously in their cells in 1977, the prison became the center of conspiracy theories that persist today about whether they committed suicide or were murdered by state agents. How does a modern democracy balance security against freedom when terrorism threatens its foundations? You're traveling now toward the mountains outside Beijing, where China's Communist Party built a secretive facility to hold high-ranking political prisoners and perceived enemies of the state. Constructed in 1958 with Soviet assistance, Xinjiang serves as China's primary political prison, holding party officials, intellectuals, and dissidents in conditions of complete secrecy that prevent any information from reaching the outside world. The facility's imposing architecture reflects Soviet prison design, with massive concrete walls and individual cells that house prisoners in solitary confinement for years or decades without trial or formal sentencing. Inmates face a daily routine of ideological study, forced confession writing, and manual labor designed to transform political thinking through sustained psychological pressure and social isolation. The prison's most mysterious feature is its complete absence from official Chinese records. The facility does not officially exist, while prisoners simply disappear from society without legal process or family notification. Daily life involves navigating a system where survival depends on demonstrating ideological conversion while maintaining enough personal dignity to endure indefinite detention. The sound of wind through mountain forests mixes with the distant noise of Beijing's traffic, while inside the prison, the silence of systematic political repression creates an atmosphere where hope becomes a luxury few can afford. International human rights organizations estimate that hundreds of political prisoners remain held in Xinjiang, but China's authoritarian system makes verification impossible. What happens when an entire prison system operates outside the law that created it? You're walking now through Dublin's cobblestone streets toward a granite fortress where Irish nationalism transformed defeat into victory through the power of martyrdom. Built in 1796 as a county jail, Kilmainham became the execution site for leaders of Ireland's 1916 Easter Rising, transforming a routine prison into a shrine that would inspire decades of struggle for independence. The facility's stone corridors and individual cells housed generations of Irish political prisoners who faced daily routines of hard labor, minimal rations, and systematic attempts to break their commitment to Irish freedom. Inmates worked in the prison's workshops, breaking stones, weaving, and maintaining the facility while enduring cold, damp conditions that regularly led to illness and death among the prison population. The jail's most historically significant feature was its execution yard, where British authorities shot 15 leaders of the Easter Rising in a series of executions that transformed public opinion and created martyrs for the independence movement. Daily life for political prisoners involved maintaining morale through secret communication, sharing nationalist songs and stories, and supporting each other through years of imprisonment while their families faced poverty and persecution outside. The sound of Dublin's church bells and street noise filtered through barred windows, offering tantalizing reminders of the free Ireland that prisoners dreamed of creating through their sacrifice. How does a building designed for punishment become a temple to the very ideals it was meant to destroy? You're crossing now the waters between Queens and the Bronx, approaching a 413-acre island that became America's most notorious jail complex, despite technically being a pretrial detention facility. Opened in 1932 on landfill created from subway excavations, Rikers houses over 7,000 inmates awaiting trial in conditions that human rights monitors have compared to medieval dungeons. The facility's 10 separate jails operate as distinct communities where violence between inmates and guards has become so routine that survival often depends on joining protective gangs or remaining invisible. Prisoners spend most days locked in overcrowded cells designed for half their current population, with limited access to education, recreation, or meaningful work programs that might prepare them for eventual release. The complex's most disturbing feature is its youth facilities, where teenagers accused of minor crimes spend months or years alongside hardened criminals while awaiting trials that may never occur. Daily routine involves navigating constant threats of violence, arbitrary rule enforcement by understaffed guards, and a bureaucratic system that often loses track of prisoners within its own walls. The sound of jets from nearby LaGuardia Airport mixes with sirens, shouting, and the constant noise of metal doors, while the East River's currents create a natural barrier that makes the island feel like another world entirely. How does a temporary holding facility become a permanent symbol of systemic failure? You're driving now through the rolling countryside outside Belfast, approaching a complex where the British government tried to solve the Northern Ireland conflict through architectural innovation and psychological pressure. Built in 1976 as the Maze Prison, this facility replaced older internment camps with a revolutionary H-block design intended to isolate Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries while denying them political prisoner status. The prison's 8 H-shaped blocks housed over 1,500 political prisoners who faced a daily routine designed to transform them from soldiers into common criminals through forced labor and denial of special privileges. Inmates refused to wear prison uniforms or perform prison work, leading to the blanket protest, where prisoners wore only blankets and lived in cells they deliberately fouled to resist criminalization attempts. The facility's most famous feature was its role in the 1981 hunger strikes, where 10 Republican prisoners died refusing food to demand political recognition, creating martyrs who transformed international opinion about the Northern Ireland conflict. Daily life involved constant tension between guards and prisoners who maintained military-style discipline within their blocks, conducting training exercises, education classes, and political discussions despite official attempts to prevent organization. The sound of helicopters overhead and the distant noise of Belfast's sectarian neighborhoods created an atmosphere where the outside conflict continued within the prison walls. When the Good Friday Agreement brought peace in 1998, the prison was demolished, but its psychological impact on both communities continues to shape Northern Ireland's politics. How does a prison become the stage where a conflict's deepest questions are fought and resolved? You're traveling now through Bangkok's humid streets toward a facility that foreign prisoners nicknamed Bangkok Hilton, with bitter irony, given its conditions that make survival a daily challenge. Built in 1931 along the Chao Phraya River, Bang Kwang houses over 8,000 inmates in conditions that regularly kill prisoners through disease, violence, and systematic neglect by overwhelmed authorities. The facility's death row holds hundreds of condemned prisoners in leg shackles, creating a permanent population that lives for years or decades in anticipation of execution by lethal injection. Foreign prisoners face additional challenges navigating Thai criminal justice system, language barriers, and cultural conflicts that often result in longer sentences and harsher treatment than local inmates. The prison's most notorious feature is its overcrowding. Cells designed for 8 prisoners regularly hold 20 or more, forcing inmates to sleep in shifts while sharing a single toilet and minimal ventilation. Daily routine begins at 6 a.m. with rice porridge and continues with forced labor in workshops where prisoners manufacture goods sold to support prison operations under guard supervision. The tropical climate creates unbearable heat in metal-roofed buildings, while monsoon rains turn dirt courtyards into muddy swamps that breed disease and vermin. The sound of Buddhist chanting from nearby temples mixes with the constant noise of overcrowded humanity, struggling to survive in conditions that international observers have called systematically inhumane. What happens when a prison system designed for hundreds must contain thousands? You're approaching now the Cape Flats outside Cape Town, where a maximum security facility became both symbol of apartheid oppression and beacon of democratic transformation. Built in 1964 during apartheid's height, Pollsmoor gained international attention when it held Nelson Mandela during his final years of imprisonment, becoming a stage where the world watched South Africa's transition from racism to democracy. The facility's design reflected apartheid ideology, with separate sections for different racial groups and conditions that deliberately created hierarchies based on skin color rather than criminal behavior. Political prisoners like Mandela lived in relative comfort with access to books, visitors, and recreational activities, while common prisoners faced overcrowded cells, minimal food, and systematic brutality from guards trained to enforce racial segregation. The prison's most transformative period began in 1982 when Mandela's presence attracted international attention, forcing improvements in conditions while creating opportunities for secret negotiations between apartheid leaders and African National Congress representatives. Daily life involved navigating complex racial hierarchies, maintaining dignity under systematic oppression, and finding hope through education and political organizing that occurred despite official attempts at suppression. The sound of wind across the Cape Flats mixed with the distant noise of township life, while inside the prison, the quiet conversations that would reshape a nation occurred in cells and visiting rooms. When democracy arrived in 1994, Pollsmoor continued operating, but with a mandate to treat all prisoners equally regardless of race. How does a prison built to enforce racial hatred become a classroom for racial reconciliation? You're traveling now through the southern suburbs of Paris toward a facility that became the epicenter of French intelligence operations during World War II and the Cold War. Built in 1898 as a model prison featuring individual cells and modern sanitation, Fresnes gained notoriety during the German occupation when both Vichy authorities and Nazi intelligence services used it to hold French resistance fighters and suspected spies. The facility's strategic location near Paris made it ideal for interrogations, with prisoners facing systematic torture designed to extract information about underground networks fighting German occupation. Resistance members faced daily routines of solitary confinement, arbitrary interrogations, and psychological pressure aimed at breaking their commitment to French liberation while identifying other network members. The prison's most feared section was its German-controlled wing, where prisoners disappeared into Nazi intelligence systems that often led to deportation and death in concentration camps. During the Cold War, France continued its intelligence role, holding suspected Soviet spies and French citizens accused of treason in an atmosphere where every conversation was monitored and analyzed. The sound of Parisian traffic and normal suburban life continued just outside the walls, while inside, the quiet work of intelligence gathering and resistance occurred in cells where lives depended on maintaining secrets under extreme pressure. Today, Frezin operates as a conventional prison, but its history as a crossroads of European intelligence continues to attract researchers studying the intersection of crime, politics, and espionage. How does a prison become a battlefield where ideas fight for the soul of a nation? You're arriving now on the tropical island of Bali, where a facility designed for local criminals became internationally famous for holding foreign drug smugglers in conditions that mix paradise and hell. Built in 1979 for 300 Indonesian prisoners, Kerobokan houses over 1,300 inmates from dozens of countries, creating a multicultural prison society where survival depends on navigating complex hierarchies based on nationality, wealth, and criminal connections. The facility's tropical setting creates unbearable heat and humidity in overcrowded cells where prisoners sleep on concrete floors while sharing minimal sanitation facilities with inmates from radically different cultural backgrounds. Foreign prisoners, particularly those convicted of drug offenses, face additional challenges from language barriers, unfamiliar legal systems, and cultural misunderstandings that often result in longer sentences and social isolation. The prison's most unique feature is its internal economy, where wealthy prisoners can purchase private cells, air conditioning, and restaurant-quality meals, while poor inmates survive on rice and water in overcrowded communal areas. Daily routine involves avoiding violence between rival gangs, participating in religious activities from multiple faiths, and maintaining hope despite sentences that often exceed a decade for drug-related offenses. The sound of tropical birds and distant ocean waves mixes with multiple languages, religious chanting, and the constant noise of overcrowded humanity trying to create order from chaos. The contrast between Bali's tourist paradise and the prison's harsh reality creates a surreal atmosphere where freedom exists just beyond walls that might as well be on another planet. What happens when paradise becomes prison for those who sought escape from ordinary life? You're walking now through North London's Caledonian Road, approaching a fortress-like structure that pioneered the modern prison system through Victorian innovation and humanitarian reform. Opened in 1842 as Britain's model prison, Pentonville introduced the separate system of individual cells and complete silence designed to encourage moral reflection and religious conversion among criminals. The facility's radial design allowed guards to observe 520 prisoners from a central hub while maintaining complete isolation that prevented any communication between inmates during meals, work, or exercise. Prisoners faced a daily routine beginning at 6 a.m. with prayer, followed by solitary labor in cells where they picked oakum, wove baskets, or operated treadmills designed to provide both punishment and productive work. The prison's most innovative feature was its emphasis on education and moral instruction, with chaplains conducting individual counseling sessions aimed at spiritual transformation rather than simple punishment. Victorian reformers believed that isolation would force criminals to confront their moral failures and choose redemption, making Pentonville a laboratory for theories about human nature and criminal behavior. The sound of church bells from nearby parishes mixed with the rhythmic noise of treadmills and the scratch of needles as prisoners worked in enforced silence. The facility's design influenced prison construction throughout the British Empire, spreading Victorian penal philosophy to colonies around the world where separate systems became standard practice. Despite its humanitarian intentions, many prisoners suffered mental breakdowns from prolonged isolation, leading to reforms that balanced separation with human contact. How do the most well-intentioned reforms sometimes create new forms of suffering? You're traveling now across the Mediterranean to an island divided by conflict, where a prison serves populations from both sides of one of Europe's longest-running political disputes. Built during British colonial rule in 1935, Central Prison continues operating in the Greek Cypriot South, while serving inmates from both sides of the island's ethnic divide, creating unique challenges for a facility caught between two hostile communities. The prison's British colonial design reflects the administrative systems that once governed the entire island, but decades of division have created practical problems ranging from language barriers to religious accommodation for different ethnic groups. Turkish Cypriot prisoners face particular challenges accessing legal representation, family visits, and cultural practices in a system designed primarily for Greek Cypriot inmates, while political tensions outside the prison walls regularly spill over into conflicts between inmates. The facility's most complicated aspect is its role in cross-community crime, where cases involving victims and perpetrators from different ethnic groups require navigation of political sensitivities alongside legal procedures. Daily routine involves managing religious observances for Orthodox Christian and Muslim populations, providing translation services for legal proceedings, and maintaining security between groups whose communities remain technically at war. The sound of church bells and mosque calls create competing soundscapes that reflect the island's divided identity, while the Mediterranean climate makes overcrowded cells nearly unbearable during summer months. Despite political divisions, the prison has become an unexpected site of cooperation, where practical necessities force communities to work together on basic human needs. How does a prison maintain humanity when the society around it cannot achieve peace? You're sailing now toward the South American coast, where France created a penal colony system that became synonymous with death, disease, and the systematic destruction of human life. Operating from 1852 to 1953, French Guyana's Bogny transported over 70,000 prisoners to a tropical hell where yellow fever, dysentery, and systematic brutality killed more efficiently than any executioner. The colony's infamous Devil's Island held political prisoners like Captain Dreyfus in isolation, while the mainland camps forced common criminals to clear jungle, build roads, and work in gold mines under conditions that killed most within their first year. Prisoners faced a daily routine beginning before dawn with thin coffee and hard bread, followed by 12 hours of forced labor under a tropical sun that regularly reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The system's most cruel feature was its doublage rule. Even after completing their sentences, prisoners had to remain in the colony as liberated convicts for a period equal to their original punishment, making freedom virtually impossible. Daily survival involved avoiding malaria carrying mosquitoes, dysentery from contaminated water, and violence from guards and fellow prisoners driven mad by tropical conditions and hopelessness. The sound of howler monkeys and tropical birds mixed with the constant noise of jungle clearing, while the humidity made even breathing difficult for Europeans unaccustomed to equatorial climates. When France finally closed the system in 1953, fewer than 2,000 of the original 70,000 prisoners had survived to see their homeland again. How does an empire's attempt to exile its problems become a monument to its own moral failure? You're sailing now through the crystal waters of Montenegro's coast toward a small island where an Austro-Hungarian fortress became one of World War II's most notorious concentration camps. Built in 1853 as a coastal defense, the circular fortress on Mamula Island was converted by Italian occupation forces in 1941 into a concentration camp for Yugoslav partisans and political prisoners. The facility's strategic location in the Adriatic made escape virtually impossible, while its stone walls and underground chambers created perfect conditions for systematic torture and execution. Prisoners faced daily routines of forced labor maintaining the fortress, standing for hours during arbitrary roll calls, and surviving on minimal rations of bread and thin soup that left most in a state of slow starvation. The camp's most terrifying feature was its use of psychological torture alongside physical brutality. Guards forced prisoners to watch executions of their comrades while conducting mock trials that ended in predetermined death sentences. Italian and German guards deliberately played ethnic groups against each other, exploiting Yugoslavia's complex national divisions to maintain control while extracting information about partisan activities on the mainland. The sound of waves against ancient stones mixed with screams from torture chambers, while the beautiful Adriatic setting created a surreal contrast between natural beauty and systematic cruelty. When Yugoslav partisans liberated the island in 1944, they found evidence of over 2,000 executions and systematic torture that had turned a defensive fortress into an instrument of genocide. Today, the abandoned fortress stands as an unofficial memorial where tourists can explore the ruins while contemplating the thin line between civilization and barbarism. How does a building designed to protect become an instrument of the very destruction it was meant to prevent? You're sailing now across the Bay of Bengal toward remote islands where the British Empire created a prison designed to break the spirits of India's freedom fighters through isolation and despair. Built in 1906 on the Andaman Islands, this facility housed Indian political prisoners in individual cells arranged like bicycle spokes around a central watchtower, earning its nickname Kala Pani, or Black Waters. The prison's 7 wings contained 696 solitary cells where freedom fighters spent years in complete isolation, forbidden from speaking to guards or fellow prisoners while performing hard labor, extracting coconut oil and weaving cloth. Prisoners faced daily routines beginning at 4 a.m. with thin gruel, followed by 12 hours of grinding grain on heavy stone wheels or operating oil presses designed to exhaust both body and spirit. The facility's most psychologically devastating feature was its complete separation from mainland India. Families could never visit, letters were censored or destroyed, and prisoners lived with no knowledge of their homeland's struggle for independence. The tropical climate created unbearable heat in the metal-roofed cells, while cyclones and monsoons regularly flooded the primitive sanitation systems, spreading disease that killed hundreds of political prisoners. The sound of waves against coral reefs mixed with the rhythmic grinding of oil presses and the occasional cry of exotic birds that reminded prisoners of the natural paradise surrounding their man-made hell. How does an empire attempt to kill an idea by isolating those who carry it? You're approaching now the outskirts of Berlin, where a medieval fortress became the Cold War's most heavily guarded prison for holding just one man during his final decades. Originally built in 1876 as a military prison, Spandau gained international notoriety after World War II when it held 7 Nazi war criminals, eventually housing only Rudolf Hess from 1966 until his death in 1987. The facility's massive walls and watchtowers were maintained by rotating guards from the 4 Allied powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, creating a Cold War microcosm where former allies maintained uneasy cooperation. Hess lived alone in a complex designed for 600 prisoners, following a daily routine of solitary meals, supervised exercise in walled gardens, and reading books from a carefully monitored library that excluded political material. The prison's most extraordinary feature was its enormous cost. Maintaining elaborate security for a single elderly prisoner required hundreds of guards and consumed millions of dollars annually from the 4 occupying powers. Daily life involved navigating complex diplomatic protocols where guard rotations reflected international tensions, while Hess himself became a symbol of how the past can imprison the present. The sound of military helicopters overhead and the distant noise of Berlin's reconstruction created an atmosphere where history's weight seemed concentrated in one man's solitary existence. When Hess died in 1987, authorities immediately demolished the prison to prevent it from becoming a shrine for neo-Nazi movements. What happens when a single prisoner becomes too dangerous to release but too symbolic to forget? You're sailing now through the Pacific swells toward a remote island where Colombia created a prison that combined natural beauty with systematic brutality in one of Latin America's most feared detention facilities. Located 35 kilometers off Colombia's Pacific coast, Gorgona operated from 1960 to 1984 as a maximum security prison where the jungle itself served as the most effective guard against escape attempts. The island's dense rainforest, poisonous snakes, and shark-infested waters created natural barriers that made traditional prison walls unnecessary, allowing authorities to focus on psychological control rather than physical containment. Prisoners faced daily routines of clearing jungle, maintaining prison infrastructure, and surviving in an environment where tropical diseases, dangerous wildlife, and extreme humidity killed more effectively than any executioner. The facility's most terrifying aspect was its complete isolation. Families could never visit due to the dangerous journey, while communication with the mainland occurred only through infrequent supply boats that brought news and new prisoners. Political prisoners and common criminals lived together in basic barracks, where survival depended on forming alliances, avoiding conflict with guards, and maintaining hope despite sentences that could last decades. The sound of howler monkeys and tropical birds mixed with the constant noise of jungle clearing and the distant crash of Pacific waves against volcanic rocks. When the prison closed in 1984, the island became a national park, where tourists can now walk trails once maintained by prisoners who knew they might never see civilization again. How does paradise become hell when freedom is just an ocean away but impossible to reach? You're driving now through the Mississippi Delta, where endless cotton fields hide a prison that transformed American penal philosophy through the systematic exploitation of primarily black prisoners. Established in 1901 as a 20,000-acre plantation prison, Parchman operated as a profit-making enterprise where inmates worked cotton fields under conditions that differed little from antebellum slavery. The facility's trustee system allowed certain prisoners to carry weapons and supervise field gangs, creating hierarchies based on race and criminal background that maintained order through violence and intimidation. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks called camps scattered across the plantation, working from dawn to dusk, picking cotton, chopping weeds, and maintaining agricultural operations that generated millions in revenue for Mississippi. The prison's most notorious feature was its use of isolation cells called the hole, underground concrete boxes where prisoners spent weeks in complete darkness as punishment for infractions ranging from work slowdowns to attempted escape. Daily routine revolved around agricultural seasons, with prisoners facing longer hours during planting and harvest, while surviving on basic rations of cornbread, molasses, and occasional meat scraps. The sound of work songs echoing across cotton fields mixed with guard dogs barking and the crack of leather straps used to maintain discipline among field gangs. Despite multiple reform attempts, Parchman's plantation model influenced prison systems throughout the American South, creating agricultural facilities that continued exploiting prison labor long after slavery's official abolition. How does a nation abolish slavery while creating institutions that preserve its essential economic relationships? You're walking now through the ancient forests outside Paris, approaching a medieval fortress where French royalty imprisoned their most dangerous enemies in towers that still echo with centuries of political intrigue. Built in the 14th century as a royal residence, Vincennes evolved into France's premier state prison, holding nobles who threatened royal authority in towers designed to impress rather than simply contain. The massive donjon, standing 50 meters tall, housed aristocratic prisoners in circular chambers where political plotting continued despite imprisonment, making the facility as much a center of conspiracy as punishment. Prisoners lived in relative comfort, compared to common jails, receiving visitors, books, and meals appropriate to their social status while plotting escapes or political comebacks that kept royal intelligence services constantly vigilant. The fortress's most infamous resident was the Marquis de Sade, who spent 6 years writing scandalous literature that would shock European society for centuries to come. Daily routine for noble prisoners involved maintaining aristocratic dignity while navigating complex court politics that continued within prison walls, where alliances and betrayals determined access to privileges or punishment. The sound of wind through arrow slits mixed with distant church bells and the scratch of quills on parchment as prisoners wrote letters, memoirs, and political treatises that would outlive their captors. During the Revolution, Vincennes briefly held enemies of the new republic before Napoleon converted it back to royal use, demonstrating how political prisons adapt to serve whoever holds power. How does imprisonment become another form of politics when the prisoners are politicians themselves? You're arriving now in tropical Singapore, where a facility built by British colonizers became synonymous with Japanese wartime brutality and post-war justice in equal measure. Constructed in 1936 as a modern civilian prison, Changi gained international notoriety during World War II, when Japanese forces used it to hold Allied prisoners of war in conditions that violated every convention of civilized warfare. The facility's tropical setting and modern design could not protect inmates from systematic starvation, forced labor, and medical experiments that killed thousands of British, Australian, and American servicemen. Prisoners survived on rice rations that provided fewer than 1,000 calories daily while performing forced labor building airfields, roads, and military installations for their Japanese captors under the scorching equatorial sun. The prison's most inspiring feature was its secret cultural life. Prisoners created theaters, schools, and religious services using improvised materials, maintaining morale through artistic expression and educational activities that Japanese guards never discovered. Daily routine involved surviving arbitrary beatings, sharing meager food rations, and finding ways to maintain hope through friendships and creative activities that proved more powerful than physical brutality. The sound of tropical birds and monsoon rains mixed with the quiet conversations of men determined to preserve their humanity despite systematic dehumanization. After the war, Changi held Japanese war criminals awaiting trial, creating a symbolic reversal where former captors faced justice from their former victims. Today, the preserved prison serves as a museum where visitors can walk through cells while contemplating the thin line between civilization and barbarism. How do ordinary people maintain extraordinary humanity when everything human is systematically stripped away? You're crossing now the flat farmland of Indiana toward a facility that houses America's federal death row in a complex designed to make execution as clinical and efficient as possible. Built in 1940 as a medium-security federal prison, Terre Haute gained notoriety when it became the site of federal executions, including Timothy McVeigh's 2001 execution for the Oklahoma City bombing. The facility's death chamber uses lethal injection procedures designed to appear medical rather than punitive, creating an atmosphere where execution becomes administrative procedure rather than dramatic justice. Death row inmates live in individual cells for years or decades, while their appeals work through federal courts, creating a permanent population that exists in limbo between life and death. The prison's most controversial feature is its execution viewing room, where victims' families and media witnesses watch through glass as condemned prisoners receive lethal injections administered by medical personnel. Daily routine for death row prisoners involves 23 hours of solitary confinement, 1 hour of exercise in individual yards, and limited contact with family members who may visit for years, not knowing when final appeals will be exhausted. The sound of farm equipment from surrounding cornfields mixes with the hum of air conditioning and fluorescent lights that create an artificial environment where natural cycles of day and night lose meaning. The facility's clinical atmosphere attempts to remove emotion from execution, making death penalty administration appear rational and scientific rather than vengeful or passionate. How does a society attempt to make killing appear humane through medical procedures and administrative precision? You're floating now in the Caribbean waters off French Guiana, approaching the most famous prison island in literature, where Henri Charrier's memoir created legends that overshadowed historical truth. While serving as part of France's South American penal colony from 1852 to 1946, this small island held political prisoners in isolation. But Henri Papillon Charrier's best-selling memoir created myths about daring escapes and prison life that bore little resemblance to historical reality. The real Devil's Island was a medical quarantine facility where fewer than 20 prisoners lived at any time, not the crowded adventure setting depicted in Charrier's book and subsequent Hollywood films. Political prisoners like Captain Dreyfus faced years of solitary confinement in individual huts, forbidden from communicating with guards or fellow prisoners while surviving on minimal rations in tropical heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. The island's most challenging aspect was its complete isolation. No prisoner ever successfully escaped Devil's Island itself, though some managed to flee from mainland camps through jungle terrain that killed most attempted escapees. Daily routine involved maintaining mental health through reading, writing, and exercise within tiny quarters while struggling against tropical diseases, loneliness, and despair that drove many prisoners to suicide or madness. The sound of waves against coral reefs and tropical birds singing created an ironically peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the psychological torture of indefinite isolation. Charrier's literary success transformed this forgotten colonial prison into a symbol of human determination, even though historians have proven that most of his dramatic escape stories never occurred. How does fiction sometimes become more powerful than fact in shaping our understanding of history? You're walking now through Sydney's King's Cross district, where a Victorian-era prison became a symbol of Australian criminal justice while housing everyone from petty thieves to notorious murderers. Built in 1841 using local sandstone quarried by convicts, Darlinghurst operated for 133 years as New South Wales' main metropolitan prison, evolving from a colonial jail into a modern correctional facility that reflected changing attitudes toward crime and punishment. The facility's imposing architecture featured thick stone walls and barred windows designed to intimidate while providing secure detention for prisoners awaiting trial or serving sentences in Australia's rapidly growing colonial capital. Prisoners worked in workshops producing goods for sale while learning trades that might provide legitimate employment after release, reflecting early attempts at rehabilitation rather than simple punishment. The prison's most famous feature was its gallows, where 79 prisoners were executed between 1841 and 1908, making it the primary execution site for colonial and early federal Australia. Daily routine involved workshops, educational classes, and exercise periods in courtyards surrounded by sandstone walls that Aboriginal prisoners had quarried using traditional knowledge adapted to European construction techniques. The sound of Sydney harbour traffic and city life filtered through barred windows, offering constant reminders of the free world continuing just beyond the stone walls. When the prison finally closed in 1914, its buildings were converted into art schools and cultural institutions, transforming a symbol of punishment into a center of creative expression. How does a building designed to contain society's outcasts become a crucible for artistic creativity? You're flying now over the Caribbean toward a U.S. naval base where America created a detention facility that exists in legal limbo, beyond the reach of both domestic and international law. Established in 2002 at a Cold War naval base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp holds suspected terrorists in conditions that human rights organizations have condemned as torture, while legal scholars debate whether constitutional protections apply to foreign nationals held on technically foreign soil. The facility's orange uniforms and metal cages became global symbols of American overreach in the War on Terror, housing nearly 800 prisoners at its peak without formal charges or access to traditional legal protections. Detainees face daily routines designed around intelligence gathering rather than criminal justice. Interrogations, religious restrictions, and psychological pressure aimed at extracting information about terrorist networks rather than determining guilt or innocence. The prison's most controversial feature is its indefinite detention policy, where prisoners can be held for years or decades based on intelligence assessments rather than criminal convictions, creating a population that exists outside normal legal categories. Daily life involves navigating military regulations, maintaining religious practices under surveillance, and enduring uncertainty about when or whether release might occur through administrative decision rather than judicial process. The sound of Caribbean waves and military aircraft overhead creates an atmosphere where normal legal concepts seem suspended in tropical heat and political necessity. Despite multiple closure announcements by different administrations, the facility continues operating as a symbol of how emergency powers can become permanent features of democratic governance. How does a democracy balance security against liberty when the threat seems to require abandoning the very values being defended? You're traveling now across Nigeria's northeastern savannah, where a colonial-era facility became the epicenter of West Africa's most challenging terrorism detention crisis. Built by British colonial authorities in 1960, this facility gained international attention during Nigeria's fight against Boko Haram insurgency, housing suspected terrorists alongside common criminals in conditions that international observers have called catastrophic. The prison's overcrowding forces over 3,000 inmates into facilities designed for 800, creating humanitarian disasters where disease, malnutrition, and violence kill more prisoners than formal executions. Suspected terrorists face indefinite detention without trial, while authorities struggle to distinguish between hardcore militants and civilians caught in military sweeps across northeastern Nigeria. The facility's most challenging aspect is its mix of ideological extremists and ordinary criminals, creating volatile conditions where recruitment and radicalization occur within prison walls, despite official attempts at separation. Daily routine involves surviving on minimal food rations, navigating religious tensions between Muslim and Christian prisoners, and enduring tropical heat in overcrowded cells that lack adequate ventilation or sanitation. The sound of Islamic prayers and Christian hymns creates competing soundscapes that reflect Nigeria's religious divisions, while the distant noise of military operations serves as constant reminder of the ongoing conflict. Despite international pressure for prison reforms, chronic underfunding and security concerns continue, making basic humanitarian standards nearly impossible to achieve. How does a nation balance security against human rights when the threat comes from within its own borders? You're driving now through Zambia's mining heartland, where a facility built to serve the copper industry became one of southern Africa's most overcrowded and violent detention centers. Constructed in 1963, shortly before independence, Mukobeko was designed to hold miners and industrial workers who violated colonial labor laws, but evolved into Zambia's primary maximum security facility, housing over 3,000 prisoners in space designed for 400. The prison's concrete blocks and high walls reflect apartheid-era architecture, creating an atmosphere where racial tensions from the colonial period continue influencing daily life among inmates from different ethnic backgrounds. Prisoners face daily routines beginning at 5 a.m. with thin porridge, followed by forced labor in workshops where they manufacture furniture, textiles, and metal goods sold to support prison operations. The facility's most notorious feature is its death row, where condemned prisoners spend years in leg shackles while appeals work through Zambia's overwhelmed court system, creating a permanent population living in anticipation of execution. Daily survival involves navigating gang hierarchies based on regional origins, avoiding violence between rival criminal organizations, and finding ways to supplement inadequate food rations through family support or prison employment. The sound of industrial machinery from nearby copper mines mixes with the constant noise of overcrowded humanity, while the tropical climate makes metal-roofed buildings nearly unbearable during the dry season. Despite government promises of prison reform, chronic underfunding and corruption continue making meaningful change nearly impossible to achieve. What happens when a prison system designed for colonial control must serve independent democracy? You're flying now over Afghanistan's rugged landscape toward a massive military complex where America's war on terror created a detention facility that operated outside traditional legal frameworks. Established in 2002 at a former Soviet airbase, Bagram housed thousands of suspected Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters in conditions that human rights groups compared to Guantanamo Bay, but with less international oversight. The facility's metal shipping containers and concrete buildings held detainees in extreme temperatures, ranging from desert heat to mountain cold, creating physical hardships that compounded psychological pressure from indefinite detention. Prisoners faced daily routines of interrogation, prayer restrictions, and cultural humiliation designed to extract intelligence rather than determine guilt or innocence through traditional criminal justice procedures. The prison's most controversial feature was its use of enhanced interrogation techniques, including temperature manipulation, stress positions, and sensory deprivation that international observers classified as torture. Daily life involved navigating cultural conflicts between American guards and Afghan prisoners, surviving inadequate medical care and maintaining hope despite uncertainty about when or whether release might occur. The sound of military aircraft and helicopter operations created constant noise that reinforced the facility's role as intelligence gathering center rather than conventional prison. When American forces withdrew in 2021, they transferred control to Afghan authorities who inherited a facility designed around intelligence needs rather than criminal justice standards. How does military necessity justify abandoning civilian legal protections during wartime? You're entering now the Amazon region near Manaus, where Brazil built a massive prison complex that became the epicenter of organized crime warfare that regularly spills into broader society. Opened in 1982 and expanded repeatedly to house over 2,700 inmates, this facility represents Brazil's failed attempt to contain organized crime through mass incarceration rather than addressing underlying social and economic problems. The complex's multiple pavilions operate as separate territories controlled by rival criminal organizations, particularly the Primeiro Comando de Capital and Comando Vermelho, who maintain military-style discipline and business operations within prison walls. Inmates face daily routines that revolve around gang loyalty rather than prison rules, with rival factions controlling different sections while conducting drug trafficking, extortion, and money laundering operations that reach across Latin America. The facility's most terrifying feature is its regular massacres, where gang conflicts result in dozens of deaths as rival groups settle territorial disputes through coordinated violence that overwhelms prison security. Daily survival depends on gang affiliation, family connections, and ability to navigate complex hierarchies where criminal organizations provide protection, employment, and social services that the Brazilian state cannot deliver. The sound of tropical birds and Amazon wildlife contrasts sharply with the noise of human conflict, while the humid climate makes overcrowded conditions nearly unbearable year-round. Despite government intervention attempts, the prison continues operating as a criminal university where young offenders receive advanced training in organized crime techniques. How does a prison become a headquarters for criminal organizations more powerful than the state that built it? You're approaching now the hills outside Damascus, where the Assad regime created a facility that Amnesty International called a human slaughterhouse for its systematic execution of political prisoners. Built in 1987 as a military prison, Saidnaya gained international notoriety during Syria's civil war as a site where an estimated 17,000 political prisoners have been secretly executed since 2011. The facility's white buildings house thousands of detainees in underground cells designed to hide the systematic killing from international observation and Syrian society. Prisoners survive on minimal rations, while enduring torture designed to extract confessions before their predetermined executions in basement areas that operate with industrial efficiency. The prison's most chilling feature is its bureaucratic precision. Every execution is documented, every prisoner photographed, and every death recorded in files that create an archive of systematic murder. Daily routine involves mass hangings conducted in complete secrecy, with bodies removed in refrigerated trucks, while new prisoners arrive constantly from Syria's security apparatus. The sound of normal Damascus life continues just miles away, while inside the prison, the silence of systematic murder replaces any hope of survival or justice. International human rights organizations have documented the facility's operations through survivor testimony, satellite imagery, and smuggled documents, but the prison continues operating with complete impunity. The Assad regime's control over information makes verification difficult, while the ongoing civil war provides cover for crimes that may constitute genocide. What happens when a government's war against its own people becomes industrialized extermination? You're traveling now toward the mountains outside Beijing, where China's Communist Party operates a secretive facility that officially does not exist while holding the country's highest-profile political prisoners. Constructed in 1958 with Soviet assistance, Xinjiang serves as China's primary political prison, housing party officials, intellectuals, and dissidents in conditions of complete secrecy that prevent any information from reaching the outside world. The facility's imposing Soviet-style architecture houses prisoners in individual cells where they spend years or decades without trial, formal charges, or family contact while undergoing ideological re-education. Political prisoners face daily routines of forced confession writing, manual labor, and study sessions designed to transform their thinking through sustained psychological pressure and complete social isolation. The prison's most mysterious feature is its complete absence from official Chinese records. Prisoners simply disappear from society without legal process, family notification, or international monitoring. Daily life involves surviving a system where ideological conversion becomes the only hope for eventual release, while maintaining enough personal dignity to endure indefinite detention without trial or appeal rights. The sound of wind through mountain forests mixes with the distant murmur of Beijing's traffic, while inside the prison, the silence of political repression creates an atmosphere where hope becomes a luxury few can afford. International human rights organizations estimate that hundreds of political prisoners remain held in Xinjiang, but China's authoritarian system makes independent verification impossible. How does a modern state make people disappear while maintaining the appearance of legal governance? You're crossing now the ancient Syrian desert, where Roman ruins cast shadows over a facility that became synonymous with the Assad regime's systematic torture of political dissidents. Built in 1971 near the historic city of Palmyra, this desert prison operated until 2001 as Syria's most feared political detention center, designed to break opponents of the Assad family through isolation and systematic brutality. The facility's remote location in the Syrian desert made escape virtually impossible, while its design created an atmosphere where prisoners faced both human cruelty and natural hardship. Political prisoners endured daily routines beginning at 4 a.m. with minimal food, followed by forced labor under the scorching desert sun with inadequate water rations and no protection from sandstorms that regularly swept across the region. The prison's most terrifying feature was its complete prohibition on speaking. Inmates communicated through whispers and hand signals, while guards enforced silence through beatings that often resulted in permanent injury or death. Daily survival required navigating a system designed to destroy personal identity through humiliation, exhaustion, and sensory deprivation that drove many prisoners to madness or suicide. The sound of desert winds and shifting sand created an eerie soundtrack to systematic human destruction, while the isolation of the location meant that screams and suffering occurred without any possibility of outside intervention. When the prison finally closed in 2001, Syrian authorities claimed it was being converted to other uses, but survivors' testimony documented decades of torture that helped establish the Assad regime's reputation for brutal repression. How does geographic isolation become a weapon when combined with systematic cruelty? You're driving now through Northern California's redwood forests toward a facility that pioneered long-term solitary confinement as a method of controlling prison violence through psychological isolation. Opened in 1989 in response to California's prison gang crisis, Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit holds over 1,000 inmates in windowless cells for 22.5 hours daily, creating conditions that psychologists have compared to sensory deprivation torture. The facility's high-tech design eliminates human contact through automated systems that deliver food through slots, while prisoners exercise alone in concrete yards surrounded by walls that block any view of the outside world. Inmates face indefinite terms in solitary based on gang affiliation rather than specific infractions, creating a system where association becomes permanent punishment regardless of behavior or rehabilitation efforts. The prison's most controversial feature is its policy of indefinite isolation. Prisoners can spend decades in solitary confinement based on intelligence reports rather than disciplinary violations, creating a population that exists in psychological limbo. Daily routine involves surviving complete sensory deprivation while maintaining sanity through reading, exercise, and meditation in an environment designed to eliminate all stimulation and human contact. The sound of ocean waves and forest wildlife filters through concrete walls, offering tantalizing reminders of natural beauty that prisoners may never experience again. Despite legal challenges and hunger strikes by prisoners, the facility continues operating as California's solution to prison gang violence through what critics call torture by isolation. When does isolation become torture, and who decides where that line should be drawn? You're traveling now across the frozen tundra of Russia's far north, where the last Soviet-era prison camp continues operating in conditions that would have been familiar to Stalin's Gulag prisoners. Located in the Yamalo-Nenets region above the Arctic Circle, Colony 14 houses life sentence prisoners in temperatures that regularly drop below 50 degrees, creating natural barriers more effective than any human-built walls. The facility's wooden barracks and workshops operate year-round despite permafrost that makes construction and maintenance nearly impossible using conventional methods. Prisoners work in logging operations, reindeer herding, and maintenance projects while surviving on rations barely adequate for Arctic conditions, creating a slow death sentence through malnutrition and exposure. The colony's most challenging aspect is its complete isolation from Russian society. Families cannot visit due to distance and expense, while the harsh climate makes escape attempts equivalent to suicide. Daily routine involves surviving brutal cold while performing manual labor that serves little purpose beyond maintaining the illusion of productive activity in an environment where survival itself requires constant effort. The sound of Arctic winds and the crack of ice create an atmosphere where natural forces serve as guards more effective than human surveillance, while the aurora borealis provides the only beauty in an otherwise hostile landscape. The facility's continued operation reflects Russia's commitment to punishment through isolation, using geography and climate as weapons against prisoners who will likely never see civilization again. How does a nation use its own harsh geography as an instrument of permanent punishment? You're approaching now the outskirts of Yangon, where a colonial-era facility became the symbol of Myanmar's struggle between democracy and military dictatorship through its treatment of political prisoners. Built by British colonial authorities in 1871, Insein has housed political prisoners through multiple military coups, independence struggles, and pro-democracy movements, becoming Myanmar's most famous symbol of political repression. The facility's Victorian architecture and tropical setting create an atmosphere where British colonial control methods continue serving military dictatorships that have ruled Myanmar for most of its independent history. Political prisoners face daily routines designed to break resistance through isolation, inadequate food, and systematic denial of medical care, while common criminals enjoy relatively better conditions. The prison's most significant feature is its role in Myanmar's political cycles. Democratic leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi have been held here during military crackdowns, while prisoners' treatment often reflects the country's broader political climate. Daily life involves surviving tropical diseases, navigating tensions between political and criminal prisoners, and maintaining hope despite sentences that can change based on political developments rather than legal procedures. The sound of Buddhist temple bells and Yangon's street life filters through barred windows, offering reminders of the free society that political prisoners fight to create through their sacrifice. During brief democratic periods, the prison releases political prisoners in mass amnesties, only to fill again when military coups restore authoritarian rule. How does a single prison become the barometer for an entire nation's freedom? You're sailing now across the Mediterranean toward a small Spanish island, where a 16th century fortress became one of Europe's most isolated political prisons during Franco's dictatorship. Built in 1579 to defend against Barbary pirates, this rocky outcrop near Cartagena was converted in 1939 into a prison for Spanish Civil War prisoners and political dissidents opposing Franco's regime. The facility's medieval stone walls and isolation made escape virtually impossible, while its strategic location allowed authorities to hide political persecution from international observers. Prisoners faced daily routines of backbreaking labor, quarrying stone, and building fortifications, while surviving on minimal rations designed to weaken resistance without causing obvious starvation. The island's most cruel feature was its complete isolation from Spanish society. Families could never visit due to dangerous seas and military restrictions, while letters were censored or destroyed entirely. Political prisoners maintained morale through secret education classes and cultural activities conducted in whispers during brief rest periods between work shifts. The sound of waves crashing against ancient stones mixed with the rhythmic hammering of quarry work, while seabirds provided the only contact with the natural world beyond prison walls. When democracy returned to Spain in 1975, the prison was abandoned, leaving behind crumbling walls and rusted chains as monuments to a dictatorship's attempt to erase its opponents through isolation and forgetting. How does an island prison become both a tomb for the living and a monument to their resilience? You're climbing now through Rwanda's Thousand Hills toward a facility that became the center of one of history's most ambitious attempts at post-genocide reconciliation through restorative justice. Built during Belgian colonial rule in 1930, this facility gained international attention after the 1994 genocide, when it held over 12,000 suspected perpetrators in spaces designed for 2,000, creating humanitarian crises that tested Rwanda's commitment to justice over revenge. The prison's overcrowding forced genocidaires and survivors to share cells, water sources, and meal times, while traditional Gakaka courts attempted to balance accountability with national healing. Inmates participated in daily work programs, growing food and making handicrafts while attending mandatory sessions where perpetrators confessed their crimes and survivors shared their suffering in structured dialogues. The facility's most remarkable feature was its integration of traditional Rwandan justice concepts with modern correctional practices, creating programs where forgiveness became part of punishment. Daily routine involved community service, educational programs, and reconciliation sessions designed to transform both perpetrators and survivors while rebuilding social bonds destroyed by genocide. The sound of Kinyarwanda hymns and traditional drums mixed with the noise of construction as prisoners rebuilt the very communities they had destroyed during 100 days of killing. When the prison released most genocide perpetrators in the early 2000s, many returned to communities where victims had chosen forgiveness over revenge, creating one of history's most successful examples of transitional justice. How does a nation choose healing over hatred when the wounds are so deep they seem permanent? You're traveling now deep into the Ural Mountains, where the Soviet Union's final political prison camp has been preserved as a museum documenting the human cost of communist ideology. Operating from 1946 to 1987 as the USSR's strictest political prison, Perm 36 held Soviet dissidents, religious believers, and nationalist activists in conditions designed to break their resistance through isolation, forced labor, and systematic deprivation. The facility's wooden barracks and watchtowers, preserved in the Siberian wilderness, housed political prisoners who faced daily routines of logging, metalwork, and ideological re-education in temperatures that regularly dropped below 40 degrees. Prisoners survived on bread rations and thin soup while working 12-hour shifts in forests and workshops where frostbite, exhaustion, and despair created constant threats to both physical and mental survival. The camp's most psychologically devastating feature was its complete separation from Soviet society. Prisoners received no news from outside, while families faced persecution for maintaining contact with enemies of the people. Daily life revolved around survival rather than rehabilitation, with inmates focusing on staying warm, finding extra food, and maintaining sanity through secret cultural activities and religious observances. The sound of wind through pine forests mixed with the rhythmic sawing of timber and the creak of overloaded sledges, while the aurora borealis provided brief moments of beauty in an otherwise hostile landscape. When Glasnost finally allowed the camp's closure in 1987, local activists preserved it as Russia's first museum dedicated to Gulag victims. How does a nation confront its past when the evidence stands frozen in time like an accusation? You're driving now across Libya's desert toward Tripoli, where Muammar Gaddafi created a detention facility that became synonymous with disappearances and systematic execution of political opponents. Built in 1970 as a conventional prison, Abu Salim evolved into Libya's primary center for eliminating political dissidents through a combination of indefinite detention, systematic torture, and mass execution. The facility's concrete blocks and high walls housed political prisoners, intellectuals, and suspected opponents in conditions designed to break resistance while hiding evidence of systematic killing from international observation. Prisoners faced daily routines of arbitrary interrogation, forced labor, and psychological pressure designed to extract confessions before predetermined executions conducted in basement areas. The prison's most terrifying feature was its policy of complete secrecy. Families received no information about imprisoned relatives, while the outside world remained ignorant of the systematic murder occurring within its walls. Daily survival involved navigating a system where guards could execute prisoners at will while maintaining the fiction that inmates were serving conventional criminal sentences. The sound of desert winds and shifting sand created an eerie backdrop to systematic human destruction, while the isolation of Tripoli's outskirts meant that screams and suffering occurred without possibility of outside intervention. The 1996 massacre of 1,270 prisoners in a single day demonstrated the facility's true purpose as an instrument of state terror rather than criminal justice. When rebels finally liberated the prison in 2011, they found evidence of decades of systematic murder that helped document Gaddafi's crimes against his own people. What happens when a prison becomes a death factory disguised as a correctional facility? You're crossing now the windswept moors of Devon, where a Napoleonic war prison became England's symbol of inescapable detention through its use of landscape as natural barrier. Built in 1809 to hold French prisoners of war, Dartmoor gained lasting notoriety as a civilian prison where the harsh moorland climate and isolation created punishment more effective than any human-designed torture. The facility's granite walls and forbidding architecture matched the surrounding landscape, where dense fog, treacherous bogs, and bitter cold made escape attempts nearly suicidal, even for prisoners familiar with English geography. Inmates faced daily routines of stone breaking, mailbag sewing, and agricultural work while surviving on basic rations in an environment where warmth and dry clothing became luxuries worth fighting over. The prison's most feared feature was its punishment cells, where solitary confinement in the dampness of Dartmoor winters regularly drove prisoners to madness or death from pneumonia and tuberculosis. Daily life involved surviving not only harsh discipline, but also the psychological pressure of complete isolation on moors where visibility often dropped to mere feet during fog season. The sound of wind across open moorland mixed with the constant hammering of stone breaking and the occasional howl of escaped livestock, while the granite landscape provided a bleak backdrop that matched prisoners' despair. Despite multiple reform attempts, Dartmoor's reputation for breaking spirits through environmental hardship made it England's most feared prison well into the 20th century. How does a landscape become complicit in human punishment when nature itself serves as jailer? You're traveling now across the frozen tundra beyond the Arctic Circle, where Stalin created a prison camp complex that became synonymous with death through forced labor in impossible conditions. Established in 1932 in the Soviet Arctic, Vorkuta forced over 200,000 prisoners to extract coal in temperatures reaching 60 degrees while building an entire city dedicated to the systematic exploitation of human labor. The complex's multiple camps spread across permafrost terrain, where survival itself required constant effort, making punishment through environmental hardship more effective than any guards. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in coal mines using primitive equipment while living in wooden barracks that provided minimal protection against Arctic storms and months of polar darkness. The camp's most deadly feature was its combination of extreme climate with deliberate malnutrition. Prisoners received rations calculated to maintain work capacity while ensuring slow death through exhaustion and starvation. Daily routine began before dawn with thin gruel and bread, followed by descent into mines where cave-ins, gas explosions, and equipment failures regularly killed workers who had no choice but to continue digging. The sound of Arctic winds and cracking ice mixed with the constant noise of mining equipment and the shuffle of prisoners' feet through snow that sometimes reached building rooftops. When Stalin died in 1953, prisoner uprisings finally forced improvements in conditions. But Vorkuta continued operating until the Soviet collapse in 1991. The abandoned camps now serve as monuments to the human cost of communist industrialization achieved through slave labor. How does ideology justify turning an entire region into a machine for consuming human lives? You're approaching now a naval base in Cuba, where America created a detention facility that became a global symbol of post-9/11 security measures operating outside traditional legal frameworks. Established in 2002 following the September 11th attacks, Camp Delta housed suspected terrorists in outdoor cages designed for temporary detention that became permanent homes for prisoners held without trial or formal charges. The facility's chain-link cells and orange uniforms became iconic images of America's war on terror, representing both determination to prevent future attacks and abandonment of constitutional protections for perceived enemies. Detainees faced daily routines designed around intelligence gathering rather than criminal justice, interrogations, cultural humiliation, and psychological pressure aimed at extracting information about terrorist networks. The camp's most controversial feature was its legal limbo. Prisoners could be held indefinitely based on military assessments rather than judicial verdicts, creating a population existing outside normal categories of law or war. Daily life involved navigating military regulations, maintaining religious practices under surveillance, and enduring uncertainty about when or whether release might occur through administrative decision rather than legal process. The sound of Caribbean waves and military aircraft created an atmosphere where normal legal concepts seemed suspended in tropical heat and national security concerns. Despite multiple presidential promises to close the facility, bureaucratic inertia and congressional opposition have kept Camp Delta operating as a symbol of how emergency powers can become permanent features of democratic governance. How do democracies balance liberty against security when the threat seems to require abandoning foundational values? You're descending now into the Romanian countryside, where communist authorities conducted history's most systematic attempt to destroy human personality through scientifically designed psychological torture. Operating from 1949 to 1952, this former monastery became the site of an unprecedented experiment in re-education, designed to transform political prisoners into enthusiastic supporters of communism through peer torture and moral destruction. The facility housed intellectuals, students, and clergy who underwent processes that forced prisoners to torture each other while destroying everything they held sacred, from religious beliefs to family bonds. Inmates participated in daily sessions where they had to confess not only their own crimes, but invent and denounce the supposed sins of their cellmates, creating cycles of guilt and complicity that shattered psychological foundations. The program's most insidious element was its requirement that converted prisoners become torturers themselves, spreading the psychological destruction through the entire prison population while creating complicity that prevented future resistance. Daily routine included forced participation in humiliating exercises, destruction of religious symbols, and sessions where prisoners beat their closest friends while guards documented the process for refinement. The soft prayers once echoing in monastery walls were replaced by screams, confessions, and the terrible silence of broken spirits, while Romanian folk songs were transformed into instruments of torture. When the program finally ended in 1952, many participants had been so psychologically destroyed that they could never function normally in society again. What remains of humanity when the very concepts of truth and loyalty become weapons against the soul? You're arriving now on the tropical island of Bali, where a facility designed for local criminals became famous worldwide for its multicultural prisoner population and survival-based economy. Built in 1979 for 300 Indonesian inmates, Karabokan houses over 1,400 prisoners from dozens of countries, creating a unique prison society where survival depends on wealth, nationality, and ability to navigate complex cultural hierarchies. The facility's tropical setting creates unbearable heat and humidity in overcrowded cells, where prisoners from radically different backgrounds must coexist while facing sentences ranging from months to decades. Foreign drug smugglers face particular challenges from language barriers, unfamiliar legal systems, and cultural misunderstandings that often result in longer sentences and social isolation from both guards and fellow inmates. The prison's most distinctive feature is its internal economy. Wealthy prisoners can purchase private cells, air conditioning, and restaurant meals, while poor inmates survive on rice and water in communal areas. Daily routine involves avoiding violence between rival gangs, participating in religious activities from multiple faiths, and maintaining hope despite an Indonesian justice system that often seems arbitrary to foreign prisoners. The sound of gamelan music and tropical birds mixes with conversations in dozens of languages, while the scent of Indonesian spices from the prison kitchen contrasts with the harsh reality of overcrowded conditions. The proximity to Bali's tourist paradise creates a surreal atmosphere where freedom exists just beyond walls that might as well be on another planet for most long-term inmates. What happens when paradise becomes prison for those who sought escape from ordinary life? You're crossing now the dusty plains outside Kabul, where decades of war have transformed a modern correctional facility into a symbol of Afghanistan's endless cycles of conflict and suffering. Built in the 1970s as Afghanistan's premier detention facility, Puli Charkhi has housed prisoners from every phase of the country's modern conflicts: Soviet occupation, civil war, Taliban rule, and American intervention. The complex's 7 blocks were designed for different categories of prisoners, but decades of warfare have created overcrowding that forces political prisoners, common criminals, and Taliban fighters to share cells and resources. Inmates face daily routines structured around Islamic prayers and survival in an environment where clean water, adequate food, and medical care remain constant challenges despite international aid efforts. The facility's most difficult aspect is its mix of ethnicities, political affiliations, and tribal loyalties that create tensions guards struggle to manage with limited training and resources. Daily life involves navigating complex hierarchies based on tribal connections, political beliefs, and criminal status, while maintaining hope despite Afghanistan's ongoing instability. The sound of helicopters overhead and distant explosions serve as constant reminders of the conflict that feeds the prison's population, while the call to prayer provides structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. Despite numerous reform attempts by different governments, the prison continues reflecting Afghanistan's broader challenges with governance, security, and basic human services. What hope exists when a nation's trauma becomes concentrated within the walls of a single institution? You're standing now in the Caucasus Mountains, where a former Soviet facility became the center of a human rights scandal that toppled a government and shocked the world. Built during the Soviet era as a standard correctional facility, Gulag Prison near Tbilisi gained international notoriety in 2012 when leaked videos revealed systematic torture and sexual abuse of inmates by guards seeking entertainment rather than information. The facility housed over 2,400 prisoners in spaces designed for 1,500, creating overcrowding that enabled abuse while hiding evidence from international observers and Georgian civil society. Inmates survived on minimal rations while enduring arbitrary beatings, forced nudity during searches, and psychological humiliation designed to destroy personal dignity rather than maintain security. The prison's most shocking feature was guards' casual documentation of abuse, filming torture sessions for personal entertainment while treating prisoner suffering as recreational activity. Daily routine involved surviving random violence, navigating hierarchies where certain inmates terrorized others with official approval, and maintaining hope despite complete absence of legal protections or complaint mechanisms. The sound of mountain winds and distant church bells from Tbilisi contrasted sharply with screams and laughter echoing through concrete corridors where guards treated human beings as objects for amusement. When the videos finally surfaced during Georgia's 2012 elections, public outrage helped defeat the ruling party while demonstrating how modern technology can expose ancient cruelties. How does a democracy confront the monsters it created in its own name? You're approaching now the Cape Flats outside Cape Town, where a maximum security facility became both symbol of apartheid oppression and laboratory for post-apartheid transformation. Built in 1964 during apartheid's height, Pollsmoor gained international attention when it held Nelson Mandela during his final years of imprisonment, becoming a stage where the world watched South Africa's transition from racial oppression to democratic governance. The facility's design reflected apartheid ideology, with separate sections for different racial groups and conditions, deliberately creating hierarchies based on skin color rather than criminal behavior or security needs. Political prisoners like Mandela lived in relative comfort with access to books and visitors, while common prisoners faced overcrowded cells, minimal food, and systematic brutality from guards trained to enforce racial segregation through violence. The prison's most transformative period began in 1982, when Mandela's presence attracted international attention, forcing improvements while creating opportunities for secret negotiations between apartheid leaders and ANC representatives. Daily life involved navigating complex racial hierarchies, maintaining dignity under systematic oppression, and finding hope through education and political organizing that occurred despite official attempts at suppression. The sound of wind across the Cape Flats mixed with township music and political discussions that would reshape a nation, while the mountain backdrop provided constant reminders of the beauty surrounding human-created ugliness. When democracy arrived in 1994, Pollsmoor continued operating, but with mandates to treat all prisoners equally regardless of race. How does a prison built to enforce racial hatred become a classroom for racial reconciliation? You're traveling now through Manila's sprawling suburbs toward a facility that became famous for its progressive rehabilitation programs despite housing some of Asia's most dangerous criminals. Established in 1940 as the New Bilibid Prison, this complex houses over 28,000 inmates in facilities designed for 6,400, creating one of the world's most overcrowded prison systems while pioneering innovative approaches to rehabilitation and self-governance. The facility's multiple compounds operate as semi-autonomous communities where inmates run businesses, schools, and entertainment programs that generate revenue while providing vocational training for eventual reintegration. Prisoners participate in daily routines that include formal education, religious services, and cultural activities ranging from dance performances to musical concerts that have gained international attention through social media. The prison's most remarkable feature is its inmate-produced performances, elaborate dance videos and musical shows that demonstrate creativity flourishing despite harsh conditions and uncertain futures. Daily life involves surviving extreme overcrowding while participating in programs designed to maintain hope and human dignity through artistic expression and entrepreneurial activity. The sound of tropical storms and Manila traffic mixes with music rehearsals, English classes, and the constant noise of overcrowded humanity finding ways to create meaning from confinement. Despite chronic underfunding and political instability, the prison's innovative programs have influenced correctional practices throughout Southeast Asia, while demonstrating that even the harshest conditions cannot completely suppress human creativity. How does overcrowding paradoxically create space for human innovation and artistic expression? You're descending now into Sao Paulo's sprawling favelas, where a prison complex became synonymous with police brutality and systemic failure before its dramatic demolition in 2002. Built in 1920 for 4,000 inmates, Carandiru housed over 8,000 at its peak, becoming Latin America's largest and most violent prison before the 1992 massacre, when police killed 111 inmates during a riot response that shocked Brazil and the world. The facility's multiple pavilions operated as separate territories controlled by different criminal organizations, creating a parallel society where inmates governed themselves through violence and intimidation, while guards maintained minimal control. Prisoners survived in cells designed for single occupancy, but holding up to 8 men, forcing inmates to sleep in shifts while sharing single toilets and minimal ventilation that made tropical heat nearly unbearable. The complex's most notorious feature was its complete breakdown of state authority. Inmates controlled drugs, weapons, and justice systems while conducting business operations that reached across Latin America. Daily routine involved navigating gang hierarchies, avoiding violence between rival factions, and surviving overcrowding that regularly led to disease outbreaks and structural collapses that killed more prisoners than official executions. The sound of samba music and Portuguese conversations mixed with the constant noise of industrial machinery and human conflict, while the sprawling concrete structures created an urban landscape dedicated entirely to human containment. When authorities finally demolished the complex in 2002, they scattered its population across multiple smaller facilities while the site became a public park where families now play where prisoners once died. What happens when a prison becomes more powerful than the state that built it? You're walking now through the ancient forests outside Paris, approaching a medieval castle where French royalty imprisoned their most dangerous political enemies in towers that still echo with centuries of intrigue. Built in the 14th century as a royal residence, Vincennes evolved into France's premier state prison, holding nobles and intellectuals who threatened royal authority in circular chambers designed more for isolation than comfort. The massive donjon, standing 52 meters tall, housed aristocratic prisoners who maintained political plotting despite imprisonment, making the facility as much a center of conspiracy as punishment. Political prisoners lived in relative luxury compared to common jails, receiving visitors and books while maintaining correspondence that royal intelligence services monitored for evidence of treasonous activities. The fortress's most infamous resident was the Marquis de Sade, who spent 6 years writing scandalous literature that would influence European thought for centuries while guards remained ignorant of his literary activities. Daily routine for noble prisoners involved maintaining aristocratic dignity while navigating court politics that continued within prison walls, where alliances and betrayals determined access to privileges or harsh punishment. The sound of wind through arrow slits mixed with church bells and quills scratching on parchment as prisoners wrote letters, memoirs, and political treatises that would outlive their captors. During the Revolution, Vincennes briefly held enemies of the Republic before Napoleon restored it to royal use, demonstrating how political prisons adapt to serve whoever controls power regardless of ideology. How does imprisonment become another form of politics when the prisoners are politicians themselves? You're arriving now in Western Australia's Port City, where a convict-built prison operated for 136 years, while evolving from colonial punishment center to modern correctional facility, and finally to UNESCO World Heritage Site. Constructed between 1851 and 1859 using convict labor, Fremantle housed transported criminals who built their own prison using local limestone while facing the irony of creating the instrument of their own punishment. The facility's imposing walls and guard towers reflected British colonial architecture adapted to Australian conditions, creating an atmosphere where European punishment theories met harsh frontier realities. Convict prisoners worked in workshops producing goods for colonial export, while learning trades that might provide legitimate employment after completing their sentences, representing early attempts at rehabilitation rather than simple retribution. The prison's most distinctive feature was its evolution through different eras, from convict transportation to local criminal justice to women's facility, while maintaining continuous operation longer than almost any other prison in the world. Daily routine involved hard labor in workshops and quarries, educational classes for literate prisoners, and exercise periods in courtyards where Aboriginal and European inmates experienced different forms of colonial justice. The sound of Indian Ocean waves and seabirds mixed with hammering from stone workshops and occasional hymns from the prison chapel, while the Mediterranean climate made outdoor work possible year-round. When the prison finally closed in 1991, it became a museum where visitors can experience 19th-century prison conditions while learning about convict transportation's role in Australian colonization. How does a prison built by prisoners become a monument to their transformation from criminals to citizens? You're traveling now through remote North Korean mountains toward a facility that officially does not exist, while housing 3 generations of families serving sentences for political crimes they may not understand. Established in 1970 in a valley surrounded by mountains that serve as natural barriers, Yodak holds an estimated 50,000 prisoners, including children born in the camp who have never experienced life outside its electric fences. The facility operates as a complete society where families serve collective punishments for political crimes committed by their ancestors, creating a population that knows no existence beyond forced labor and ideological indoctrination. Prisoners work in coal mines, logging operations, and agricultural projects from dawn to dusk, while surviving on corn soup and wild plants gathered during brief rest periods between work shifts. The camp's most dystopian feature is its schools, where children born in detention learn basic literacy alongside political indoctrination while remaining completely ignorant of the outside world or their families' supposed crimes. Daily life revolves around survival rather than punishment. Inmates focus on finding food, avoiding hypothermia during brutal mountain winters, and navigating social hierarchies that determine access to slightly less dangerous work assignments. The sound of mountain streams and forest wildlife creates an almost peaceful atmosphere that contrasts sharply with systematic destruction of human dignity occurring within the camp's boundaries. The camp's existence remains officially denied by North Korean authorities, making it one of history's largest prisons where the outside world's ignorance becomes part of the punishment system. What happens when an entire society becomes a prison that refuses to acknowledge its own existence? You're standing now beside the Thames in Victorian London, where reformers built an experimental prison designed to transform criminals through surveillance and solitude, but instead created madness and failure. Constructed in 1821 based on Jeremy Bentham's panopticon design, Millbank housed 1,000 prisoners in individual cells arranged around a central observation tower that allowed guards to watch every inmate without being seen themselves. The facility's innovative architecture aimed to create perfect surveillance while implementing the separate system that isolated prisoners to encourage moral reflection and religious conversion. Inmates faced daily routines of solitary labor in cells where they picked oakum, wove baskets, or operated treadmills while forbidden from communicating with fellow prisoners during work, meals, or exercise. The prison's most tragic feature was its psychological impact. Complete isolation drove many prisoners to madness, suicide, or physical collapse, forcing authorities to abandon the separate system after documenting its destructive effects. Daily life involved surviving not only harsh discipline, but also the oppressive atmosphere of constant surveillance where every action was monitored and recorded by guards trained to prevent human contact. The sound of Thames shipping and London street life filtered through prison walls, offering tantalizing reminders of normal society continuing just beyond the reach of isolated prisoners. When the facility finally closed in 1890, authorities demolished it rather than continue operating a prison that had become synonymous with humanitarian failure despite its reformist intentions. How do the most well-intentioned reforms sometimes create new forms of suffering they were designed to prevent? You're approaching now the Bavarian countryside outside Munich, where Nazi Germany established its first concentration camp as a prototype for the systematic destruction of human dignity and life. Opened in 1933 as a facility for political prisoners, Dachau became the model for the Nazi concentration camp system, training SS personnel in methods of dehumanization that would be implemented across occupied Europe. The facility's barracks and administrative buildings created an atmosphere of military precision applied to systematic cruelty, where efficient organization served genocide rather than legitimate military purposes. Political prisoners, Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups faced daily routines designed to destroy identity through forced labor, arbitrary punishment, and psychological pressure that reduced human beings to numbers in administrative records. The camp's most sinister feature was its function as a training center where SS guards learned techniques of dehumanization before assignment to other facilities throughout the Nazi Empire. Daily survival involved avoiding selection for medical experiments, maintaining enough strength for forced labor, and preserving some sense of human dignity despite systematic attempts to reduce prisoners to subhuman status. The sound of German commands and marching feet mixed with prisoner whispers and the industrial noise of forced labor operations, while the Bavarian landscape provided a peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with systematic evil occurring within the camp. When American forces liberated Dachau in 1945, they found evidence of systematic murder and medical experiments that helped document Nazi crimes while serving as prototype for later trials. How does a society's descent into barbarism begin with the systematic destruction of human dignity? You're traveling now through rural Georgia, where Confederate authorities created a prison camp that became synonymous with deliberate cruelty and systematic neglect during America's bloodiest conflict. Established in 1864 to hold Union prisoners of war, Andersonville housed over 45,000 men in an open stockade designed for 10,000, creating conditions that killed 13,000 prisoners through disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The facility's wooden walls enclosed bare ground where prisoners built shelters from scraps, while surviving on cornmeal and beans that provided inadequate nutrition for men already weakened by combat and capture. Union soldiers faced daily struggles for survival in an environment where clean water, medical care, and adequate food became luxuries that determined who lived and who died from preventable diseases. The camp's most controversial aspect was whether conditions resulted from Confederate resource shortages or deliberate policy to weaken Union military strength through prisoner mortality. Daily routine involved finding food, water, and shelter, while avoiding violence from fellow prisoners driven to desperation by starvation and disease that created Hobbesian conditions where civilization collapsed. The sound of Georgia pine forests and distant plantation life continued normally, while thousands of Union soldiers died from preventable causes within the stockade's walls. When the war ended in 1865, the camp commander was tried and executed for war crimes, becoming the only Confederate official executed for treatment of Union prisoners. The preserved site now serves as a national cemetery, where visitors can contemplate how quickly civilization can collapse when humanity is deliberately abandoned. You're sailing now across the White Sea toward remote islands, where Orthodox monks once sought God, but Soviet authorities created a laboratory for systematic human destruction. Founded as a 15th-century monastery, Solovetsky became the Soviet Union's first major concentration camp in 1923, transforming sacred spaces into instruments of political terror while pioneering techniques later used throughout the Gulag system. The facility's ancient stone walls and Orthodox churches created an atmosphere where spiritual seeking was replaced by systematic dehumanization of political prisoners, intellectuals, and clergy. Inmates faced daily routines of forced labor, clearing forests, building canals, and maintaining prison infrastructure, while surviving on minimal rations in the Arctic climate that killed through cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The camp's most disturbing feature was its deliberate desecration of religious spaces. Churches became barracks, altars served as interrogation tables, and monastery bells announced work shifts rather than prayers. Daily survival involved navigating a system designed to destroy faith, hope, and human dignity through isolation on islands where escape meant certain death in frigid waters. The sound of Arctic winds and seabirds mixed with prisoner work songs and the occasional echo of Orthodox chants that seemed to haunt the monasteries even after their conversion to instruments of terror. When the camp finally closed in 1939, authorities had refined techniques of psychological and physical destruction that became standard throughout Stalin's expanding prison empire. How does a place dedicated to finding God become a laboratory for destroying the human soul? You're crossing now the ancient Syrian desert, where Roman ruins cast shadows over a modern facility that became synonymous with the Assad regime's systematic brutality against political opposition. Built in 1971 near the historic city of Palmyra, Tadmor operated as Syria's most feared political prison until 2001, housing thousands of opponents in conditions designed to break spirits through isolation, torture, and complete separation from Syrian society. The desert location made escape virtually impossible, while providing cover for systematic abuse that occurred beyond observation by international monitors or Syrian civil society. Political prisoners endured daily routines beginning at 4 a.m. with minimal food, followed by forced labor under scorching sun with inadequate water, while guards enforced complete silence through beatings that often resulted in permanent injury. The facility's most terrifying feature was its prohibition on speaking. Inmates communicated through whispers and gestures, while maintaining their sanity through internal mental exercises and shared memories of life before imprisonment. Daily survival required navigating a system where guards could kill prisoners without accountability, while maintaining the fiction that inmates were receiving rehabilitation rather than systematic torture. The sound of desert winds and shifting sand created an eerie soundtrack to human suffering, while the isolation meant that screams and torture occurred without any possibility of outside intervention or documentation. When authorities finally closed Tadmor in 2001, survivors' testimonies helped document decades of systematic torture that established Syria's reputation for political repression. How does geographic isolation become a weapon when combined with systematic state cruelty? You're climbing now through Austrian countryside toward a facility where Nazi Germany created a concentration camp designed around forced labor in granite quarries that killed through systematic exhaustion. Established in 1938 following the Anschluss, Mauthausen operated as a Category 3 camp for incorrigible political offenders, housing prisoners deemed irredeemable by Nazi ideology while exploiting their labor to extract granite for monumental construction projects. The facility's terraced design followed the contours of granite quarries where prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, carrying massive stones up steep steps, while guards beat anyone who faltered under impossible loads. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, and later Jewish deportees faced daily routines designed to kill through work, hauling granite blocks weighing over 100 pounds while surviving on starvation rations that provided insufficient energy for such brutal labor. The camp's most sadistic feature was the parachutist's jump. Guards forced exhausted prisoners to jump from quarry cliffs while carrying stones, creating the appearance of suicide to hide systematic murder. Daily survival involved avoiding selection for elimination while maintaining enough strength to perform impossible labor that served Nazi construction projects throughout Austria and Germany. The sound of hammers on stone and prisoner work songs mixed with guard commands and the occasional fall of exhausted prisoners tumbling down quarry steps. When American forces liberated Mauthausen in 1945, they found a death camp disguised as a labor facility, with granite monuments built from stones carried by prisoners who died creating them. How does a regime transform human beings into disposable tools for its own monumental ambitions? You're sailing now across the Bay of Bengal toward remote islands where British colonial authorities created a prison designed to break Indian freedom fighters through complete isolation from their homeland. Built between 1896 and 1906 on the Andaman Islands, this facility housed Indian political prisoners in individual cells arranged like bicycle spokes around central watchtowers, earning its nickname Kala Pani, or Black Waters, from Hindu beliefs about spiritual pollution from crossing dark seas. The prison's design reflected British understanding of Indian psychology. Separation from family, culture, and sacred geography was considered more devastating than physical torture for prisoners fighting for independence. Freedom fighters faced daily routines of solitary labor, extracting coconut oil and weaving cloth while forbidden from speaking to guards or fellow prisoners, creating psychological pressure designed to break political resistance through enforced isolation. The facility's most cruel feature was its complete separation from mainland India. Families could never visit due to dangerous seas and colonial restrictions, while letters were censored or destroyed to maintain prisoners' ignorance about independence movements. Daily survival involved maintaining mental health through meditation, memory exercises, and secret communication systems that allowed political prisoners to share information despite official prohibitions on contact. The sound of tropical storms and ocean waves mixed with the rhythmic grinding of oil presses and occasional bird calls that reminded prisoners of the natural paradise surrounding their man-made hell. When India gained independence in 1947, the prison became a national monument where visitors can walk through cells while contemplating the price of political freedom. How does an empire attempt to kill an idea by isolating those who carry it in their hearts? You're floating now across the Mediterranean toward a fortress where French royalty imprisoned political enemies. But Alexandre Dumas created one of literature's most famous escapes. Built in 1524 as a coastal defense, this fortress off Marseille evolved into a state prison holding political and religious dissidents while inspiring literary works that transformed real suffering into romantic adventure. The facility's stone chambers housed Protestant ministers, political rebels, and mysterious figures whose stories blended historical fact with literary imagination to create legends more powerful than reality. Political prisoners lived in tiny cells carved from fortress walls, surviving on bread and water while enduring Mediterranean heat in summer and bone-chilling dampness during winter storms that made stone walls weep with condensation. The prison's most famous feature became its literary reputation. Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo transformed this forgotten royal prison into a symbol of determination and revenge that overshadowed its actual history of political repression. Daily routine involved surviving isolation while maintaining sanity through whatever intellectual activities prisoners could improvise from minimal resources, often creating art, poetry, or philosophy in margins of prayer books. The sound of seabirds and waves against ancient stones mixed with wind through fortress corridors where real prisoners experienced hardships that literature would transform into romantic adventures. When the fortress finally closed as a prison in 1890, its literary fame had already made it more famous for fictional escapes than real imprisonment, demonstrating literature's power to reshape historical memory. Where does real history end and literary legend begin in our understanding of human suffering? You're walking now through Dublin's cobblestone streets toward a granite fortress where Irish nationalism transformed defeat into victory through the power of martyrdom and sacrifice. Built in 1796 as a county jail, Kilmainham evolved into Ireland's most significant political prison when it became the execution site for leaders of the 1916 Easter Rising, transforming routine imprisonment into sacred martyrdom for Irish independence. The facility's stone corridors and individual cells housed generations of Irish political prisoners who faced daily routines of hard labor breaking stones and weaving while enduring cold, dampness, and systematic attempts to break their commitment to Irish freedom. Revolutionary prisoners maintained morale through secret communication, sharing nationalist songs and stories while supporting each other through years of imprisonment as their families faced poverty and persecution outside prison walls. The jail's most historically significant feature was its execution yard, where British authorities shot 15 Easter Rising leaders in a series of killings that transformed public opinion and created martyrs whose sacrifice inspired decades of independence struggle. Daily life for political prisoners involved maintaining dignity under systematic oppression while preserving cultural identity through Irish language, traditional music, and political education that continued despite official attempts at suppression. The sound of Dublin's church bells and street noise filtered through barred windows, offering reminders of the free Ireland that prisoners dreamed of creating through their sacrifice. When independence finally came in 1922, Kilmainham became a museum where visitors can walk through cells while contemplating how imprisonment sometimes strengthens rather than breaks the human spirit. How does a building designed for punishment become a temple to the ideals it was meant to destroy? You're sailing now through cold Tasmanian waters toward a peninsula where the British Empire created its most innovative and feared penal settlement using geography as the ultimate prison wall. Established in 1833, Port Arthur represented the pinnacle of 19th century penal design, using Tasmania's natural barriers, shark-infested waters, dense wilderness, and treacherous cliffs to create an inescapable prison that influenced correctional philosophy worldwide. The settlement pioneered the separate system of individual confinement, housing 1,100 convicts in cells while implementing complete silence during work, meals, and chapel services designed to encourage moral reflection through isolation. Prisoners worked in timber mills, shipyards, and coal mines under strict supervision, with any infractions punished by solitary confinement in the model prison where inmates wore masks and were known only by numbers rather than names. The facility's most psychologically devastating element was its systematic attack on personal identity. Prisoners lived in complete silence, wore identical uniforms, and experienced sensory deprivation designed to break their spirits through methodical dehumanization. Daily routine began at 5:30 a.m. with bell signals, followed by 14 hours of silent labor and mandatory evening prayers in a chapel where prisoners sat in individual wooden boxes to prevent communication. The sound of Southern Ocean waves and Tasmanian devils mixed with rhythmic hammering from workshops and the occasional scream from punishment cells, while the peninsula's natural beauty contrasted sharply with systematic human suffering. When the prison finally closed in 1877, it had influenced penal design throughout the British Empire, while demonstrating that even the most sophisticated control systems cannot permanently suppress human dignity. How does isolation become so complete that freedom itself becomes unimaginable to those who experience it? You're approaching now through medieval Paris streets toward a fortress that became the most famous prison in European history before revolutionaries destroyed it stone by stone. Built in 1370 as a fortress defending Paris, the Bastille evolved into the Bourbon monarchy's premier state prison, holding aristocrats and intellectuals in comfortable apartments while representing arbitrary royal power that could imprison anyone without trial or formal charges. The fortress's 8 towers contained furnished rooms rather than cells, where wealthy prisoners brought servants and furniture while enjoying regular meals and family visits denied to common criminals in ordinary jails. Political prisoners faced the psychological torture of indefinite detention rather than physical brutality. The lettre de cachet system allowed royal arrest without explanation, creating uncertainty more terrifying than conventional punishment. The facility's most mysterious element was its anonymous prisoners, including the legendary Man in the Iron Mask, whose identity remained hidden behind a velvet mask that sparked centuries of speculation about royal scandals. Daily life for noble prisoners involved maintaining aristocratic dignity while navigating court politics that continued within prison walls, where favor and disgrace followed the same patterns as Versailles. The sound of Notre Dame bells and Parisian merchants mixed with footsteps in fortress courtyards where political plotting continued despite imprisonment, while the Seine's flow past ancient walls marked time for prisoners whose release depended on royal whim rather than legal process. When revolutionaries stormed the fortress on July 14, 1789, they found only 7 prisoners, but unleashed symbolic power that toppled an empire and made the Bastille's destruction the birth cry of modern democracy. What makes a building so powerful that its destruction becomes the symbol of an entire civilization's transformation? You're drifting now toward the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, approaching an island that became America's most famous prison while keeping its deepest mysteries locked beneath layers of concrete and legend. Operating from 1934 to 1963 as America's escape-proof federal prison, Alcatraz housed the country's most notorious criminals in 5-by-9-foot cells, surrounded by freezing currents that made freedom seem impossible. The facility's strategic location and sophisticated security made it ideal for containing prisoners who had escaped from other institutions, creating a population of escape artists and criminal masterminds who spent their days plotting against seemingly perfect security. Inmates like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly faced daily routines of complete silence during meals and work, solitary exercise in individual yards, and constant surveillance designed to break spirits through sensory deprivation and social isolation. The prison's most enduring mystery remained the 1962 escape attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, who disappeared into San Francisco Bay waters while leaving behind a puzzle that continues fascinating investigators decades later. Daily life involved surviving not only harsh discipline, but also the psychological pressure of knowing that freedom lay just 1.25 miles away across waters that had never been successfully crossed by escaping prisoners. The sound of foghorns and seabirds mixed with the constant noise of waves against rocky shores, while the San Francisco skyline provided tantalizing reminders of normal life continuing just beyond reach. When the prison finally closed in 1963, it left behind unanswered questions about human determination, the nature of freedom, and whether perfect security can ever truly contain the human spirit's desire for liberty. What does it mean that humanity's greatest monuments to control ultimately become testimonies to the uncontrollable human spirit? You're standing now at the threshold between past and future, where technology promises to transform punishment in ways that would astound the architects of history's cruelest dungeons. Imagine facilities where artificial intelligence monitors every heartbeat, facial expression, and neural pattern, while virtual reality creates punishment environments limited only by programmers' imagination. The digital prison of tomorrow may eliminate physical walls while creating psychological barriers more sophisticated than any stone fortress ever built by human hands. Prisoners might serve sentences in virtual worlds designed to rehabilitate through immersive experiences, while biometric monitoring ensures compliance with behavioral modification programs that reshape personality at the neurological level. The future facility's most transformative feature could be its ability to customize punishment and rehabilitation for individual psychology, creating personalized experiences that address specific criminal behaviors while maintaining public safety through technological rather than physical containment. Daily routine might involve neural therapy sessions, virtual reality community service, and biometric meditation programs designed to restructure criminal thinking patterns while preserving human dignity through advanced understanding of psychology and neuroscience. The sound of humming servers and gentle notification chimes could replace clanging metal doors and shouted commands, while holographic counselors provide therapy sessions that adapt to prisoners' emotional states in real time. Whether tomorrow's prisons become instruments of genuine rehabilitation or sophisticated tools of total control will depend on choices we make today about technology, justice, and human nature. As we close our journey through humanity's long experiment with punishment, what kind of future will we choose for those who break our laws?